listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. I'm back. Jamarl, I hear you had a great show yesterday?
Yeah.
I was not part of it?
Yes.
I was listening to some of it.
Excellent.
And good conversations. It was good to hear your voice. It was also good to see you maskless. It makes perfect sense. When I'm not in the studio, there's nobody to justify wearing a mask around.
Yeah.
Of course, it would be the same vice versa, but, you know, it was good briefly.
Yeah.
and now
it's like the one day out of, a year?
Exactly.
Come on.
Exactly. Anyway, it is, for those listening, October 5th. It's just past 7 a.m. Eastern, and it's time now for headlines. Let's get into them. First up in COVID stats. Yesterday in the United States, there were 172,688 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,829 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 103,785 cases per day. That's still a decrease of 24% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 56% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and now 65% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 43,826,849 people across the United States. It has killed 703,362 people. Dr. Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, is planning to announce his resignation today as head of the Giant Research Agency and return to his previous job as the director of the National Human Genome Research Institute. That's according to the Washington Post and Politico reporting that late last night. Collins plans to leave by the end of the year and is expected again to announce his resignation today. Johnson & Johnson said Tuesday it has asked the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to authorize booster shots for its coronavirus vaccines, but has left it up to the FDA and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to decide just who should get their boosters and when. In national news, U.S. flights of Afghan evacuees will resume after being halted for a small breakout of measles among the Afghans. Most of these flights are U.S. airlines flying to military bases in Qatar and Germany. State Department senior advisor Harold Koh is resigning from his post with a scathing memo. He's criticizing the Biden administration's use of Trump-era Title 42 as quote-unquote inhumane. Title 42 gives the administration the ability to bar people from entering the country during a health crisis, which Biden is using to deport thousands of migrants without giving a chance to seek asylum. Yesterday, the Supreme Court said Washington, D.C. residents are not entitled to a voting member of Congress. The court issued its decision without a hearing, citing a similar case from 2000 that concluded that D.C. does not get this right because it is not a state. In international news, the Czech Republic signed a $630 million deal to buy a new air defense system for its military from Israel. Specifically, they bought the Spider system, which is made by the Israeli state-run company Rafael Advanced Defense Systems Limited. The system would provide protection against aircraft, helicopters, bombers, cruise missiles, and other weapons. In tech news, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp went down for more than 6 hours yesterday. The company stated the issue was, quote, due to a configuration change in the router system, which cascaded disruptions through the network, end quote. However, many are calling this a cover for a hack, as a whistleblower and former employee of Facebook is set to testify to Congress today. This comes after she leaked thousands of documents to the media and 60 Minutes, airing an interview slamming the tech giant. Of course, we're talking about Facebook there. And in holidays news, today's World Teachers Day, National Be Nice Day, and National Get Funky Day. Probably being nice and getting funky go together for some people, for some couples, and some other people. Anyway, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're back.
Yes.
Jamarl, did you notice the Facebook tech slowdown yesterday personally?
No. I don't really use Facebook. I tend to use Twitter more than Facebook. I don't know the last time I've put anything on Facebook. But I did get, who was it? I think my wife said something about it, that Facebook was down. And it was someone else that said something that was like, hey, Facebook is down. At this point, it had been down for like hours, like half of the day. But I don't know anything like as to the reason why. I thought it was coincidental, quotes, that the whistleblower was going to have their testimony today,
Yep.
and that the whistleblower thing took place on Sunday on 60 Minutes. And so, it always looks a little bit weird when the organization that's the center of a firestorm basically tanks. Some people were making the point that they thought Anonymous might have taken them down, but there was no evidence for that. That was just people being conspiracy theorists. But, I mean, who knows? If, information comes out that Facebook was intentionally putting out information, well, put it this way. If information comes out that says Facebook knowingly, based on their own studies and based on their own internal research, that disinformation, hate, rage, and those type of things keep people on the site, meaning they basically monetize those things in order to keep more engagement into the site. And you find out that, wait, they knew about this and they were doing this in order to increase revenue? Would some hackers or some people who, consider themselves the Batman of the public, the vigilantes of electronic whatever, go after him? Maybe. But again, there's no real evidence for anything being taken down from this kind of hacking type of stuff. But look, I look at it as possible until further notice. It's just kind of put a pin in it, and maybe information will come to fruition later. Have they said anything about why the site went down, or has there been any kind of reporting on the reasons?
A sort of generic, like, sysadmin kind of geek explanation, like a non-explanation, which is basically, and I'll repeat, due to a configuration change in the router system, and a lot of people are just snoozing at that point.
I see.
Which cascaded disruptions throughout the network. So it sounds, quote unquote. So it sounds like they made some change to their back-end system, to the way their database processes information or something. And it's not just one database, but either that or, just server configuration, something like that on the back end. In other words, it's not like somebody's redesigning the website and they put in the wrong piece of code. They're doing deep work or whatever. Yeah. That's what it sounds like, if you can take their explanation for it. I don't know, man. The whistleblower thing, yes, these companies do monetize this kind of thing, but that's also, I don't know, they're being, in one direction, pulled to profit by getting people to hate each other and fight each other or whatever, because that keeps them engaged on the platform. But then, Congress also wants to pull them in the opposite direction. Congress wants to pull them in multiple directions. Either you control what people do on the platform to make people safe around each other, and or you don't control people's access to feeling things or saying certain things just because you don't like them feeling or saying things. You know what I mean? Another way of putting this is, like, I can make the argument, maybe on important issues, Facebook should get people to argue more. Now, does that look like hate to some people? Maybe, but a lot of what people are complaining about with Facebook is the absolute suppression of certain sides of arguments and the consequent inability to actually have real conversations about them. You know what I mean? So in other words, like, Facebook could go in a couple of different directions. Our government kind of wants them to go in simultaneously in opposite directions, with the Republicans wanting more free speech and Democrats wanting less of it, broadly speaking. Right. This whistleblower is coming out and complaining about one side of it, which is Facebook not doing enough to control hate speech, hate, and misinformation. Instead, they should be doing more. But if you do more to control hate speech, misinformation, bullying, that kind of thing, you're inevitably going to be suppressing people's ability to say random things, because what exactly is bullying? What exactly is misinformation? What exactly is hate speech? With hate speech, I'd hope that there's some clear definition there. If somebody brings up some random anti-vax article and they get angry at somebody else about it in a thread or whatever, and somebody else reports them and gets them kicked off or shadow banned or banned outright or whatever, suspended for a couple of weeks, there are, like, more than one sides to each argument. You know what I mean? And so I just get worried that you have these countervailing pressures that aren't going to work out to some favorable equilibrium for the public.
Well, I think her point is that the pressure and the incentives are built around this notion of getting people engaged on the site, and that Facebook's own research, again, this is based on research, found that people who are getting hateful or angry and disinformation in and of itself were were the ways that they were using basically to keep people engaged in the site. From the standpoint of getting rid of data, I mean, yeah, that's always one of those issues of, how much suppression and everything that's taking place. But at the point where there's clear research that's kind of indicating that this is the way to make profit, and the way to make profit is to basically get people engaged, even if what they're being engaged on is disinformation. I mean, if you found out that there was research that said, hey, this level of disinformation is basically getting X number of people killed, You still pushing for, yeah, keep it going. Keep that level of disinformation going that's keeping X number of people killed, even though there's been 700,000 people that dropped dead from COVID already. Is that true?
It depends on the specifics, but broadly, yeah, because I think that what you lose by being like, okay, let's combat this disinformation. Who's doing the combating? Who's watching the watchmen? Do I trust any of the people who are actually trying to control the flow of this stuff to restrict it to just the things that affect the bottom line statistically in terms of how many people are dying? Or are they going to use it in all sorts of screwy ways to benefit them, to shout out stories that criticize them, that kind of thing? As the vehicle of power grows larger and larger, its reins grow more attractive for anybody, this wheel for anybody to take a hold of, that kind of thing. That's the concern that comes in.
So just so I'm clear, everything should be allowed.
No, I didn't say that. I said it would depend on the specific. That's what I led in my answer.
Give me a specific.
Well, you give me one. You're putting all the questions to me.
Well, I'm just asking you. You're saying, I asked you, should everything be allowed? You said no.
Exactly.
I said, okay,
I'm not
so
bipolar.
should they allow...
I can say something in the middle.
Well, yeah, I guess what I'm asking, I'm trying to figure out what that is. What is the thing where you would look at it and say, okay, that's problematic. This pushing people to be angry and pushing out disinformation, even if it's killing people, should be allowed. Because that's how it premised this. Even if you found out that this information was killing people, we have 700,000 people dead, should you allow it? Your response is yes. So I'm asking you, what of it would you look at and be like, okay, that's too far?
But here's the thing. You're trying to be like, what exactly is the line? I'm saying there's a line that exists. I'm simply first trying to establish that there is a point at which is reasonable for them to shut speech down. There's a point at which is not reasonable. Right. And all I'm establishing, first of all, is that a line exists. And then what I'm saying is that this debate, this whistleblower coming out, is pushing sort of one side of that argument. And I want to make sure that while we pay attention to the specifics of what she's saying, we don't lose track of the big picture, which is if we pay too much attention to what he's saying, we use that to justify banning more speech, banning more random people online who are just saying things other people don't like. Because I'll put it like this, coming back, what if it's not something that's going to get somebody killed, but it's just something that pisses other people off? And Facebook realizes that if you show people information that they disagree with, they're likely to argue about it. I think, frankly, people being able to see things they disagree with is good for them. They learn from it, assuming that they're more or less reasonable people, that they're going to process it in some way. It might, they might not agree, disagree. They might not even read the full thing, but at least they've encountered any other perspective that ideally they'll subsume meaningfully. Yeah. My point isn't to do the hard line of it. Okay, this is exactly where we should cut the line, because for me, that's not quite as interesting. I admit that there is one. And so you could give me a bunch of specific examples and I could come back with specific answers, but that's not the conversation I was trying to have.
But again, if the research shows that people are getting killed, it doesn't matter to you.
No, I said that it does. I said that there's a line. I just don't know exactly where it is.
Okay. But I guess the point I'm making here is I started this premise off the thing. If the research is showing and indicating that people are getting killed based on the information that they're putting out, and Facebook is doing it in order to incentivize or create profits,
at a certain point,
would that be okay? Your answer was yes, they shouldn't do it, because your biggest concern, or the larger concern, was that they were suppressing various information, various points of view.
I didn't say that they absolutely should never do it. I said that by and large I'm against it because of what I'm worried it would lead to. A simple version of the slippery slope argument, which I could get into more, because admittedly you bring up the slippery slope argument, and justified or unjustified, people tend to just focus on that argument. Yeah. But I'm bringing it up. That could happen. I don't want it to happen. But, there probably are some cases in which, say there's like a new strain of COVID going around that's as deadly as anthrax, and people got it by drinking Kool-Aid, and there's a viral trend going around trying to get everybody to drink Kool-Aid so they'll catch this new deadly strain of anthrax. I get why Facebook and TikTok might be like, hey, let's chill this viral trend down. That's a little bit too far. I get that. I'm not going to come down on them for that.
What about the Benadryl challenge? I think this was a TikTok thing where people would drink large amounts of Benadryl or take a bunch of capsules of Benadryl in order to get this psychedelic effect associated with things. Yeah. And TikTok was like, yeah, we're going to put our foot down on this particular trend. Technically, they're not telling people to kill people. Technically, TikTok is not the ones that are telling people to do it. But it's on the platform, and kids are basically picking it up and running with it. Should TikTok suppress that particular content?
I don't know. That gets a bit murkier for me. I think that I completely understand why they do it. And ultimately, if we step back from what I think is moral or what you think is moral, there's the brass tacks of, are people going to trust this platform if they keep getting shut down for things that are stupid? Because I think people are willing to accept a certain level of censorship if they feel that it's completely appropriate. Right. Like, in a certain day and age, you don't expect to see porn in the morning newspaper. You're not like a free speech absolutist when it comes to like certain things. People are willing to accept, okay, I get, they have editorial standards, and that they would apply the same logic to a platform. It's just that so much of what's getting done is going overbound. Yeah. It's going overboard. It's going a bit too far for people. And so if we detach from our own individual morals, when we look at the bottom line, and just the legitimacy of this institution in society, there are plenty of people who are not going to be down for it at a certain point. And that's that's Facebook's decision. That's Congress's decision, how far they want to push them. That's a balance of these competing forces, the public, Facebook, Congress, all seeing how willing they are to accept what the other one is going to do at a certain point.
I think for me, the interesting part is the gray area. The interesting part to me is, okay, what's allowed and what's not allowed. Anybody can pontificate on these kind of general themes and grand themes of things, but taking a position and saying, okay, right here, this is where the line is, that gets more interesting to me because that gets into this notion of...
That is when the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. And anytime that Congress is going to get these guys to... Because basically, one way or the other, Congress is trying to get them to act like a publisher, period. The moment that Congress is like, especially Democrats more than anything else, is saying, you need to censor more content. Okay, what's the content that you want me to censor? Is it content that you just dislike because you don't necessarily like its effect on you? But the other way around is, what if it is having an effect on the politics of things? Like Europe, for example. One of the things came up had to do with Europe saying, you're screwing with our politics based on the positions that you're kind of forcing us to take, because we're basically stuck in this thing where people are taking positions based on basically disinformation. Now, then the question becomes, okay, well, what do you mean by disinformation? Is it really disinformation, or is it just information that you disagree with? Like, that stuff gets very murky, and that stuff gets very difficult to kind of suss out and figure out.
Yeah.
So,
and also disinformation, misinformation. The disinformation thing specifically is like a counter-intel reference to Soviet propaganda in this weird way.
Yeah.
But if you think about that, between disinformation and misinformation, they set you up with a bad faith approach to any competing side on any issue. If you say my information is the information and your way, my way, or the highway, effectively, your information is misinformation, my information is information. You're disinforming, I'm informing. You know what I mean? Granted, sometimes that's totally true. It seems like there are people who really should know better who are saying absolute crap just because it gets them likes and views. But if that's your go-to in any argument with somebody on an important issue, like COVID stuff, for instance, then you set up this bad faith dynamic where you automatically assume that the other party is both wrong and malicious, which is the wrong way to do it. Whether you're looking scientifically, even politically, a lot of politics, you'd probably do better to vilify a small minority, not the bulk of people that are opposing you, but to be like, guys, you have a lot of valid questions. There's some people I see doing some gnarly stuff, but a lot of you have really valid questions. Let's engage instead of just dismissing all conversation as misinformation or disinformation, because there's a lot of it floating around, but both practically, rhetorically, and factually, not all of it's going to be misinformation. Some of it's going to probably bear fruit and actually be informative, interesting conversations there.
Yeah, it depends on what it is. I mean, this kind of gets into the specifics of things again.
Yeah,
I don't know, man. It's not an easy topic to hit. It gets into this notion of research, of what research indicates, research into human psychology and how human beings engage with, these kind of platforms and everything else. As a software engineer, for the most part, I had full control over what you engage within a system that you were using. And I could choose to show you things that were beautiful and loving, or I can choose to show you things that would get you engaged and get you angry. And at the point where we have this kind of monetized incentive to show people things that gets them angry and riled up and pissed off, et cetera, it's a race to the bottom on some level.
It's true. But, at a certain point, it's calling like you see him. Like, I understand why you're trying to get me to put my rubber to the road, so to speak. You're trying to figure out, okay, where will you stand on this specific issue?
Yeah, because that's what matters.
How are you going to fall? It is, but you also want to keep the general stuff in mind so that when you come to any specific issue, when you're deciding on it, you don't lose track of all of the other relevant issues. And I get it's like these two different modes.
Yeah, no, I feel you. I mean, general is easy though. Anybody can say, it's like a political thing. It's a political speech where a politician would say, I am completely against corruption and blah, 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 blah. Yeah. And it's like, yeah, that's right. That guy's completely against corruption. But then when you get to the specifics, what he's talking about corruption is not exactly corruption. And what he is doing is specifically corruption.
You realize that you meant different things by it.
Completely different things using the language. Yeah.
And that part's important too. Yeah. And that's why all the politicking and rhetoric of all of the setting up the frame of the debate can be useless when you actually get into this.
Exactly. It's like you can have a speech given by a Republican and a Democrat. Both of them are saying completely same thing, different meaning. And so it's like, that's why I pretty much check off when I hear stuff like that. Now, the specifics are the things where it gets like, okay, that's what the guy means. And it's like, that's not the easiest. That's the one that's a little bit more risky of a position because you're going to get hit either way that you take it. And look, the whole free speech stuff, the whole disinformation stuff, unfortunately, a lot of stuff that is not disinformation gets let's say, dovetailed in almost to stuff that they want to consider disinformation in order to prevent a particular argument or conversation. And I mean, the COVID thing.
That's a reverse kind of generalization. You're talking about, people who are overwilling to generalize.
For example, right.
No, and I'm saying categorizing things as disinformation and misinformation is being overly general with the way that you're doing it. It's a similar problem that people can make in different areas.
It's the way they were doing the COVID stuff with Germany, where they would say that conversation is problematic and disinformation. It's like, it was a conversation. We took no position on COVID, nor did we say anything that was bad about COVID. And you guys are acting as if just the very act of having a conversation about this particular topic is somehow, subverting the conversation. It's like, it's nonsense. No, it doesn't work that way. It's whatever that line is between, okay, this person is a publisher versus this person is an editor. No, I said that wrong. Or platform. Well, that needs to be delineated. And that needs to be delineated in clear terms, as opposed to having Congress telling these guys, be more of a publisher, despite the fact that being more of a publisher undermines their platform status. That's what it seems to be. It seems that they're being continuously pushed to be publishers, despite the fact that they're supposed to be platforms.
Yeah.
And that has not been delineated in law or anything at this point yet. And Section 230 is not adequate to deal with this reality of things.
Well, and even if you admit that we're in a crisis, focusing on COVID for a minute, so we're in a long-term pandemic, year and a half now. The crisis is ongoing, and it's hitting different parts of the world harder, but still, we're in a crisis, broadly speaking. I'll classify there are two types of ways, and you can think of the military. You want a similar level of compliance. The government wants a similar level of compliance from the public in dealing with this crisis, as you might expect a general to want from soldiers under him. Yeah. But there are two types of compliance they'll want. They'll want you to accept the basic premises, and then there's also this additional ask, which is to do things exactly how they say. So in order to join the military, they will want you to have both of these things. They will want you to know what a gun is and how to use it. They'll want to agree that the enemy is bad, that the force you're fighting for is good. They'll want you to act like that, certainly. And then if they tell you to run out into a field, if they tell you how to go about executing the war they're trying to fight, they will tell you exactly what to do, and they expect you to do it pretty much exactly as they say. Right. Allowing, of course, for some individual scrutiny.
They'd be like, you'll get people killed, son, if you don't do exactly what we said.
Yeah. That kind of thing. But I think the public is far more used to one of those than the other. The public's far more used to, let's agree on science, let's agree on the what, the foundation, but how exactly we're going to do it, specifically in the United States. Usually the states, it's left up to, okay, how are the states going to implement this local policy? That's, of course, what we did. Other governments may be a little bit less of that way. But in the case of COVID, misinformation, disinformation, information, whatever, I get why they might want to keep perfect unity with what's going on. Okay, vaccines are good, masks are good, whatever. I understand that they're trying to do that kind of thing. I think that's a little bit too heavy-handed, but I get what they're going for. Where they're truly going over the board, and arguably you could say it's all going over the board, but where they're really going over the board is like when they're talking about, okay, should I wear a mask inside a closed subway car without anybody else in the car, with nobody else in the car? That's not, that person believes in masks. They're in favor of masks. They're just disagreeing with a specific application of the idea of how you use a mask, how the bureaucracies have chosen to dole out the rules, the laws, what you're supposed to do, what you're allowed to do. They agree on the facts. They agree on the what. They just disagree on the how. And that should always, unless you're in the most diehard military setting where you need a soldier to go out and do exactly what you're saying, because of it's a life and death situation. I understand there's that kind of, that's about the only, or like military intelligence, that kind of thing. That's about the only case in which you expect absolute conformity from an ununiformed member of the public. And yet they're requiring it of us. Yeah. Whether we're in uniform or not, across the society, across all our conversations on YouTube and off increasingly, it seems.
I'll give you another one. Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom recently came out and said he's basically mandating the kids get vaccinations. And it's like, whoa, that's too strong. But could Facebook or Twitter say, well, the very fact that you're arguing that that's too strong gets you taken off the platform? Well, I think that would be insane. I mean, to me, there are alternatives to basically forcing kids to get vaccinations. And even kids who did get vaccinations, we have about 70% of adults right now that are vaccinated. And within the 70% of those adults getting vaccinated, I would wager that those adults know that their kids are susceptible. You have more kids who are getting sick at this point. And within the susceptibility, you would have many of those adults, I would argue, and there's no way for me to know it as a flat fact per se, but I would say it's likely that the majority of those adults will probably get their kids vaccinated. But even if those kids are vaccinated, those adults still may take issue with those kids being put into a school that I consider to be a perfect storm. I mean, you basically have this confined space where you're going to have some kids who are the parents that are anti-vaxxers, who are not for the stuff. And those kids, and many of the kids there, if any of them get sick, the other kids are going to be susceptible. And when those kids go back home, they're not going to be wearing a mask all day in the house at home, meaning that they're going to be spreading that stuff around. Newsom's take that, okay, we're going to get kids vaccinated. Okay, that's fine. But let's be clear that just because kids get a vaccination doesn't necessarily mean they can't get it sick, nor does it mean that they can't necessarily spread it, and nor does it mean that in those confined spaces that you're going to have a certain degree of viral load. You can't assume that everybody is going to have this kind of perfect wearing of masks. I think schools are problems in this case. And in this very specific situation where Newsom is trying to force this stuff on everybody else in order to force the kids into school, I think that's somewhat dicey. Now, if you have that type of argument or that type of conversation saying, look, that's way too strong, especially since there are alternatives to kids doing this. I mean, you're just trying to force these kids into school. Well, does Facebook say, hey, that's too strong of commentary, and we don't necessarily like you being on the air saying that because it goes against what Governor Newsom is saying? Yes, they could very well say that. I could entirely see them doing something like that and taking a person down or killing the thing, even though the argumentation or the back and forth is basically on the bureaucracy. Nothing has been said about the efficacy of vaccines. Nothing has been said about COVID not necessarily being real. It is being this kind of argument on whether or not the policy is correct.
Yes.
And I think that's where you get into this notion of, yeah, that's problematic. You can't even argue the policy. Like, we're not even arguing science at this point. We're arguing the relationship of the political space to that science and to the information about it.
Yeah.
And within the context of that, you can have, good faith actors making that point. But then you can get these media companies that basically are knocking this stuff off because they don't necessarily want to even have that kind of conversation. That's where I think it gets just absurd, like where even the talk can't be had. There needs to be this kind of delineation between people who are putting out misinformation and people who are intentionally lying to themselves and deluding themselves and other members of society and everything else. And yeah, I would say getting people killed on some level. Versus good faith conversations. And those things can't necessarily be dovetailed within one another in a way that kind of kills argumentation and kills debate. That's the thing I'm more concerned about.
Yeah. People are willing to accept different types of not just authority, but even like authoritarianism, like that kind of thing. If you're stuck in a crowded fire as a kid and some random adult, some stranger that you've never seen before, with their physical strength, pulls in, grabs you, pulls you out, rips you out. They've completely violated your bodily autonomy, but they've also saved your life, and you're probably going to thank them for it. The community's going to celebrate them, that kind of thing. Even though the person was technically a transgression. Of course it's not. Of course it's not. You know what I mean? They're saving your life, that kind of thing. That's an extreme example that I don't want to draw it too far.
It's like the emergency warrants, the aggressive action in that case.
Yeah, emergency warrants aggressive action. And I think the type of emergency is going to warrant different types of aggressive action. But, and I'm not saying this is a kind of authoritarianism, and this is light authoritarianism. There's a far cry between this kind of thing and like, okay, they're going to be frog walking in the streets of DC, in brown suits a couple of years from now because of COVID. I'm not saying that kind of thing. But when you combine this kind of light authoritarianism, this kind of light information handling with absolutely dysfunctional authorities who don't know how to lead, you get the worst of both worlds. And guess what? I think both of them kind of reinforce each other. It makes the authorities less competent over time because they don't self-scrutinize. They're not able to self-improve their behavior because they're not talking about what they're getting wrong. And two, it makes those same authorities a bit more fidgety about how you're going to respond next time. And so then they get even more authoritarian the next time a crisis comes around. It's like
overbearing.
You know what I mean? A lot of people who have those who have somewhat dysfunctional parents know a little bit about what that's like. Sometimes you go through a crisis, they don't handle it well, they're in control of everything. And after that crisis is over, often they don't learn anything. They just are even more in a hole or whatever. And they've persisted their habit of acting in control, even though they're not actually, even though they're not actually controlling things favorably.
Cops is a great example of this. And I don't mean a television show. On YouTube, for the last few weeks, I've been binge watching interrogations, phenomenally interesting. But also cops in this channel called like Auditing the Auditors or something like that, where basically the guy goes through and audits the behavior of the cops and the various people who are engaged in these kind of interactions. And what you typically see is cops are horrible at their jobs and very little about the law, and basically would allow authority to take place. So for example, if you're in public, you can videotape whatever you want. Just because a person is in public, they don't necessarily have any kind of right to privacy at the point where something is taking place in the public. Well, if you're videotaping a cop will be like, hey, put your video camera down. Why? I have every right to do this. No, you don't have the right to do this. I'm going to take you to jail. And all of these threats and all of this other nonsense that come into play where they're trying to lock people up. I mean, or they would come to somebody's. There was one case where the guy was in his building. I think that was like 3 a.m. The guy owns the business. And the cop is like, why are you guys here? I'm not answering that. Well, what's your name? I'm not answering that either. Why are you here? And this guy has every right to basically tell this cop, leave. You know, I'm not doing anything wrong. You have zero evidence of anything going wrong. There's not been a break-in. There's not been any indication of anything. But at this point, the cop, because of his authority thing, believes that it is his right to either detain this guy and pull this guy out of the building. Like, it's stuff like that that happens 1,000 times a day, constantly, issues of authority, without any real change or recognition of how horrible they are at their jobs. Whether it's a parent, whether it's a government, whether it's a cop, it's almost like this is just kind of a factor of bad authority. And, you know, to make it, or to tie it to what we were talking about, it gets that much worse when social media, which is supposed to be social media, gets basically pushed and cajoled in order to acquiesce to that level of authority, even in cases where it should not acquiesce. And that's when it gets dicey. I mean, look, the Facebook thing is fascinating to me because the Facebook thing is probably going to create some new, I don't know, precipice for law or some new context or something where this stuff is going to be regarded just because of the claims that are being made. But I got to be honest, I don't know what's on the other side of that. And, you know, and the difficulty of me saying, just asking you, hey, where's that line? Is like, I accept there's a line conceptually. I have no idea what that line is. Well, at some point, these guys are going to have to make that line clear because you can't keep pushing these guys to be publishers when they're under the auspices of a platform.
I'm pretty sure I'm not going to like wherever they choose to put the line.
Yeah.
Which is why we're going to keep talking about it.
Yeah, because it's going to be a far cry from fire in the theater. Well, put it that way.
Yeah, and here's another way to look at this. Man, the technologies, these are like 15 years old. As far as creatures go, these are less than 2 decades. I'm talking about social media platforms here.
Yeah, they're brand new. Yeah.
You can argue the forums that existed in the wild, wild west of the internet in the 90s, early 2000s that, you know, that people used to talk. The bulletin boards, the forums, they came a little bit later, those kinds of things. Those were their own creature, but they weren't social networks. Facebook, right. MySpace, Twitter, these are all completely new. And, of course, the tech companies that are stewarding these things or whatever that are hurting all of us through them, they're new too.
Yeah.
You know, their rise, their preeminence, the dot-com bubble that broke back in the late 90s, you didn't see these kinds of companies. Mm-hmm. There were plenty of large companies, but not like this type of information broker.
Yeah.
It's a new beast.
Between a billboard where a person is going to versus something that is being fed to you. 2 different things.
Yeah.
Like, you know, it's one thing if you choose. It's another thing when there's logic there that says, hey, take a look at this story. It's going to really get you, you know, get your blood boiling. It's like, oh, I'm angry at this. And you move on. One of the other things they found for Instagram, we need to close it.
And they coincide with your smartphones too. The rise of smartphones where you have all this stuff in your pocket, literally
it's like
on your person.
Looking at your phone all day.
Social contact, the social pressure, the parasocial relationship, where it's not you with some other random person in society. It's you watching not just the TV screen, but like some random internet celeb.
Yeah.
Where you can message them occasionally. It's just this weird filter feed top-down thing that the sociological effects we don't know about, but the legal, you know, how we're going to set up the precedent for managing these things. We're in that space right now. Anyway.
Well, that's the catch. Whatever the sociological effects are, that I would say the legal should go around that, not necessarily just this other stuff. Yeah. But even that gets a little dicey. Like, we can find out that just as human beings, there's all sorts of horrible sociological effects from interacting with these social media networks in the way that they are. Are we going to be okay with not engaging with them? Like if you found out that McDonald's gives people cancer in 20 years and the way that we go about our affairs, McDonald's, Burger King, fast food, et cetera, and all of this cheap food gives people cancer, are you going to be okay with the law saying, hey, maybe we should get rid of these fast food places?
I would personally be okay with
I would be okay with that too.
Okay, but I'm a rich hoity-toity whatever. I live blocks from the closest McDonald's. It's not in my corner. It's like 4 blocks away. I haven't been there.
No, I know
and the same thing with Facebook. We started out this conversation with Facebook, bro. I checked in briefly when I saw that this thing, and I was like, oh yeah, Facebook's not loading. When I got a headline, I check in my Facebook, I think once a day, once every couple of days, mainly just to be like, to spy on my family and be like, okay, how are these people doing? And to look at the number of notifications I have, which make me feel cool until I click through and realize that they're all like notifications from groups and stuff. They're personal notifications. All my time is spent on Twitter, and I don't even spend much time there. And I used to spend all the time on Facebook.
Yeah.
I've drifted away from it, as have so many people.
Yeah.
You know?
I ended up on Twitter more often,
Yeah.
because I use Twitter to organize stories and organize the content and stuff like that.
No, we drift away, but
Yeah.
I'm going to take us out. Peter Oliver on the line, EU correspondent for RT International. He provides daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. We'll be back with him on the other side of this short break, talking about Nord Stream 2, the cost of and the rise of energy prices, French aspirations. Also, what's going to be coming in EU leadership after Merkel's departure. Again, that's with Peter Oliver. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from our station in Washington, D.C. So one of the conversations that we've been having, especially since the election, in the German elections that took place maybe a week or two ago, has been what is taking place after Merkel. Merkel has been there for 16 years. She's been such a dominant force in the European Union that what does the European Union and what does Germany look like after her leaves a big, big question mark. One of these cases, or let's say countries that want to take advantage of this, is, of course, France. France was one of the larger countries and one of the more dominant countries in the European Union. And with Merkel going, does Macron have certain visions of greatness, seeing that his adversary, well, not adversary, his compatriot is stepping down? We're going to get into this and a few other issues of things that are going on in Europe, including energy spikes and pricing and everything else. So joining us to have this conversation is the one and only Peter Oliver. He's EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, economic news from across the European Union. And Peter, you're just recovering from COVID. How are you, my man? Peter?
I'm back in the land of the living. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. I have to say I'm very glad that I'm very aware that because I'm vaccinated, the version I've had is very much the edited for TV version of COVID-19. I would not want to see the director's cut.
What was it like? I mean, what did it feel like? What was
rough.
your...
It felt like the bare bones of a very, very bad cold, a very heavy cold, but just a real sapping of energy, absolute theft and robbing of my sense of taste and smell, and a real confusion. Like that was the really difficult part, because as you can hear, I'm pretty much back with us today. But by Friday of last week, I'd be in the kitchen pointing at the kettle, pointing at the teapot, and be going, my girlfriend, going to my girlfriend, do you want it? Do you want the thing that comes out when I put that in there and then it makes this? You mean, do I want a cup of tea? Yes. Do you want a cup of tea? Yeah, okay. So it was just a real mess with the logical forming of thoughts, everything like that. But thankfully, that seems to be a little bit better now.
That's scary. That is super scary. And Peter, thank you for joining us. You're a strapping young lad. I don't think we've ever, you're in your like late 30s or 40s, right?
I mean, I would say I'm in my my late mid 30s, or sometimes that would
that's kind of what I was guessing. Usually with men, I want to shoot over and not under with the maturity thing. But that sounds about right.
I'm 30. I'm 38. I'm reasonably fit. I ran a half marathon 2 weeks before this hit.
That's what I was getting at. Yeah. So you're relatively young. You're in shape. You do stuff. This is how you reacted. That's crazy. I'm sorry to hear that, Peter. I'm glad you recovered.
No, thanks very much, lads.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it couldn't have happened at a worse time, because I tested positive on election night here in Germany.
Wow. Yeah, that's rough, man. That is totally rough. But yeah, we're glad that
we had to throw a lot of plans out, but we did get coverage of the election and everything that went with it on the night and early the next morning. And then as soon as I was free, thankfully, because of COVID, I do have a studio at home. So we were able to relocate everything to the home studio, broadcast from there. And sort of messed up a lot of plans, but it worked out all right in the end. And speaking of that election, she's still there, you know.
Yeah.
For now. 9 days.
She's right. She's still there until a new government is formed. She's going to be staying
exactly.
there. So let's start here. The Nord Stream 2 gets approval. Now, the idea, I think I was in Germany once before, and the energy costs in Europe is obscene. I mean, be it Czech Republic, Germany, etc. And so the idea that they were going to take any issue with trying to get additional energy into Germany seemed very weird to me and overtly political. And political in a way that there should have been consequences if they were ever going to try to kill this project. But this became that much more clear recently, where energy costs in Europe basically spiked like to obscene levels. And so right here, it says the wholesale price of natural gas rose 440% between January and October. Gas is used for heating, but it also generates electricity. So fossil fuels also influences how electricity costs. It says in Germany, the electricity has become 140% more expensive. I mean, what has been going on? Right here, 340% in Italy, 425% in Spain. Why the dramatic energy costs? This was also taking place in China, where China was trying to get more gas from Russia. And even in the UK, where they were basically having this kind of petrol, where they had to bring in like the military in order to bring in petrol. What is going on in Europe with the energy costs going this dramatic?
It's all gas related. If you can get the gas price down, which is a big ask at the moment, but if you can get that gas price down, electricity prices, you would imagine, will follow. It's worthwhile pointing out that those numbers that you read out there, they're the market prices. Like my bill here in Berlin hasn't gone up 140%. However, I am staring down the barrel of around a $10 a month increase for my electricity bill. I haven't exactly checked that 100% yet, because even though I talk about these things for a living, I am as remiss as everybody else in my own personal life. So we are seeing those prices starting to come on to the consumer. The ultimate solution to this is if you had a major gas infrastructure project that could take Russian gas directly from Russia straight into the EU, and provide enough to power 27 million homes, it would be advisable to use it. Now, I'm being a little facetious there because, of course, they do have that in Nord Stream 2. It's just Nord Stream 2 comes with all of the political baggage as well that we've seen over the last few years, and in particular, the last 2-3 years, really. It's now finished. It's now ready. There's one side of the argument saying that Russia is using Nord Stream 2 or using gas prices to hold sections of Europe to ransom. I know the German tabloid Bild, which has a real bee in its bonnet about this whole thing, is very much gone with that angle, that agenda today. There's also the side that says, as far as Russia, Gazprom, and the German government are concerned, Russia is upholding all of its contractual obligations when it comes to gas delivery. It's just not selling any more gas on the market. They're saying, if you want gas from us, great, we'll provide it, but you've got to sign up to a long-term contract. Nobody signed up to those contracts yet, or certainly the agreement is nowhere near in place. They're looking for contracts that will go on for, I think, 14, 15 years. I know Hungary just signed one independently of the European Union, but we're still waiting to see how many other contracts will be snapped up. Because once that's done, this will all go right. However, what we are, of course, and to use that from Game of Thrones, winter is coming. So people hearing that energy prices are high, that electricity, gas, that heating your home may cost more this winter, that we may well be in for, and this was just some news that came out last night, a record cold winter this year in Europe. All of these things, I know long-term weather forecasting isn't the most exact of sciences, but it is a science nonetheless. And so these warnings are definitely there. Nord Stream 2 would put that would certainly alleviate some of those problems. It wouldn't be the be-all and end-all. It wouldn't be the be-all and end-all solution at all, but it would lower the prices from where they are now, which are record highs. And what we've seen is the pipeline itself, it's just got another green tick next to its name, a green check next to its name when it comes from the Danish Energy Authority. They signed off on the string one of the pipeline yesterday. That was on Monday. So basically, the way the pipeline works is it's 2 tubes go from Russia into northern Germany. String 1, string 2. The first string of that, the Danes have signed up, which goes through their waters, and for them to sign off on, they have done exactly that and said that it ticks all of the boxes. That will now be gradually filled with gas till it's at its maximum level, to make sure that it can take the load, the maximum load that it can take. And then that string would be ready for use. The whole project doesn't go into play, though, until both strings have been tested and gone through this. And we understand string 2 is currently going through the pre-check process at the moment, and we should expect that to be done fairly soon. Now, there was talk of this pipeline being up and running by the end of the year. I was looking at the news from yesterday. More people being a little more conservative about these estimates now.
Oh, they're stepping back.
It being stepping back from that it may well be a little longer. Now, that's not great news if you look at for the pipeline itself and for getting those energy prices down. If you look at how things in Germany may pan out with the government, because we're currently in coalition talks. You've got the Greens who don't want this project at all. They would happily scrap it tomorrow, even though that wouldn't probably be the wisest. It's almost undoable to do that when you think about the billions that have already been spent on it.
Not to mention the energy prices.
You could well end up with a government. It would start all kinds of problems.
Wow.
The energy crisis, legal crisis, political, diplomatic crisis, you name it, it would be there. So it's highly unlikely that they would try and stop it entirely, but they would certainly be reticent towards relying on it, particularly at a time whereby it would seem that it's the thing that you would rely upon in order to get gas into Germany, into the rest of Europe. I said Hungary have already signed up a deal, I think, to provide gas for that isn't specifically with Nord Stream 2. That's just a long-term gas deal with Russia that Budapest has done. But there's a lot of onus on countries to sign up to these long-term deals, of course. When it comes to these type of deals, though, then Ukraine comes into the mix, because Ukraine, of course, hates Nord Stream 2 because they are worried that it will see them cut entirely out of the energy transit, gas transit it provides them. I used to say it provided them $3 billion a year. Now, I had been corrected by the very eminent Ben Aris of business in Eastern Central European, Russian, everything like that fame when it comes to these type of stories. Pointed out it was only around 2 billion now because of deals that had already been in place. So Ukraine has already lost out money, it would seem, because of different deals that have gone on regarding the southern street gas pipelines that already cut them out. So they're trying not to lose as much money as possible. What that would require them to do, though, is to sign a new deal with Russia, and there doesn't seem to be much appetite for any type of bilateral agreements between Kiev and Moscow, particularly from the Kiev side at the moment.
Yeah.
That would be anathema to the Zelensky government. So that leaves us in the quandary that we're in, whereby we need gas here in Europe. The consumers are starting to see the impact of these rises, and there is a solution that is almost 100% complete. That is, so it would make sense to do it. Whether it gets done as quickly as we would have hoped, that's not clear at the moment. As I said, we were talking about this, and certainly Gazprom were talking about this, the Russian gas giant. They were saying by the end of the year this will be up and running. Starting to hear a few people suggest maybe not by the end of 2021 now.
Very interesting. I mean, no pun intended, I would imagine it sends a shiver up some of the people's spine seeing the cost of gas going up and knowing that the winter is going to be that much worse. I'm curious on something. As I watch Europe now, Europe has gotten really fascinating to me recently. I used to enjoy the European Parliament, all of that stuff. And with Merkel stepping down, there's this question about, okay, what direction or what is Europe going to be without Merkel being the face of Europe? Macron seems to have aspirations of taking that leadership position in Europe. And my question kind of boils down to, what does Europe look like with Macron being the face of Europe as opposed to Merkel? And more importantly, what relationship does France have with the other countries of Europe? Meaning, would that break down in that way? Would it turn out to be that way? Does France have that level of relationships with the other countries of Europe where it could subsume that leadership role specifically with Macron, I would imagine, is the head of that. And what would be the difference between those two leaders in regards to the direction that it takes Europe?
I think you've got to look at three potential candidates. I know it's not really, there is a structure in Europe that the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is in charge essentially of the EU. The European Council President Jean-Michel, it's Charles Michel, I beg your pardon. That shows that's not a good sign for what I'm about to say. And of course, European Parliamentary President as well. But but obviously, for the last few years, it has been Angela Merkel that people have come to see, particularly when it's come to things that have gone on with relations between the EU and outside the EU. We've seen leaders either from the UK, from the United States, from Turkey come here to Berlin for talks with Angela Merkel. Now, there are a couple of schools of thought about where this goes next. Either we see Italy take over that role, or we see Emmanuel Macron, as you mentioned, or potentially Olaf Scholz, the Social Democratic Party's candidate for Chancellor. I think Mario Draghi would be a massive outside bet. I can't see Italy being able to take that type of clout. I can't see Draghi himself being able to do it. He does have, of course, he does have huge what you call huge credentials when it comes to these type of positions. He was the head of the European Central Bank. He knows all about the fiscal issues when it comes to it. I just don't think he's going to be the one to do it. Olaf Scholz, he very much set himself up as Angela Merkel ran on election campaigns for a long time saying, look, guys, you know me, you know what you're going to get. Things are pretty much all right. Do you want more of that? If you do, vote for me. And that's pretty much what she did, without absolutely, dumbing it down as much as I possibly can. He tried to do that a lot during the election, and really he was the winner personally in that election 9 days ago. He was the finance minister. He's been the finance minister under Merkel. I guess he still is the finance minister in the caretaker government that we have at the moment. There's certainly potential that he could step into those shoes of Angela Merkel and try and lead the way that Angela Merkel did. However, does he have the decisive charisma of Angela Merkel? I don't think many people would say she was hugely charismatic, but no, he doesn't. And that's why it's going to be difficult, because we don't know what we're going to get with him. So that leaves us with Emmanuel Macron, somebody who's basically wanted this since he came into power. Yes, now, he gave a speech at the Sorbonne back in 2017, in which he lambasted the way Europe had been ran. He said it was too weak, too slow, too inefficient. He wants, quicker, better, faster under him is the way he wanted to say it. His ideas were for an integrated European Union defence, complete reform of the Eurozone, a unified asylum policy, which is something Angela Merkel tried to do for a long time. And the asylum policy in the European Union is something which it's just a disaster zone. The way it works, I was about to say the way it works, it just doesn't work. How asylum operates across the EU when you have a common border for that bloc. So Macron's been talking about putting these things in place for a long time. In terms of his relationship with other countries inside the European Union as a bloc, France certainly has a better relationship with countries like Greece than Germany would. There's still a lot of animosity in Athens and certainly in further afield in Greece for the way that Germany acted over the euro crisis that followed on from the global financial crisis.
Shut down their banks.
Which put swinging cuts on Greek economy, austerity that was through the roof. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Greece at that time, and it was, it was one of those where people would ask, where have you come from? I would say, not Berlin. I've not come from Berlin. Because people were genuinely angry with not just the way things had been done by their own governments, but also with the way that Germany had gone after it. So there'd be a better relationship in some ways with those countries that have been that were hit hardest by austerity. Macron has a good relationship with most people, but the idea and what we saw when it comes to outside of the bloc is how things are going to go with the likes of the United States and France in the future. We saw problems over AUKUS, the submarine deal which the US nixed on Australia's behalf with France. In fact, we've had Secretary of State. There seems to be actually a bit of a chance to try and put that relationship between Paris and Washington correct. We saw Joe Biden meeting with Emmanuel Macron. We've seen phone calls. We've seen America's two best French speakers in the highest offices were in Paris just this week, with Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and John Kerry turning up in Paris yesterday for talks. So there's attempts to do that. How it would change things, I'm not sure it would change things massively. If Macron was to end up or find himself in that role, he would be looking to try and do as Merkel did. But if he's going to do that, he has to be accepted by those within the European Union. And how much German politicians, many of which, depending on what type of coalition we get here, will have been part of the government or around the government, if they're willing to take play a second fiddle in some ways to France, I'm not sure about that. So they may face pushback from Germany, of all places.
Oh, that would make sense. Yeah. Following on with their current supremacy under Merkel, we've been talking largely in the German elections about the different candidates' perspectives on on Russia or the United States. I'm curious about China, though. I don't think we hit that nearly as much with you. Based on who's in power, how do you think they will feel about China, trade ongoing with China? And, I'm just curious, balancing that relationship with the relationship with the United States. I'm curious what you see coming out of that, Peter, in terms of who gets put in place, who's the next chancellor.
Germany's relationship with China is fascinating, and we do not have time to get into it because Germany's relationship with China is basically, we are on side with our NATO allies, we're on side with the United States, but just don't ask us to do anything actually pragmatic against China because we like making money with China because we're making lots of money with China. So Germany will sign everything that's put in front of them, which is the strong words and condemnations when it comes to things like human rights. They will say, in climate, you must do better. And then the next day, they will have signed increasing trade deals. So whoever ends up, now this is where it could, because the two big parties, there's two types of coalition we're essentially looking at right now in Germany. One's called a traffic light coalition that is made up of the Social Democrats with the Green Party and the Free Democrats, called traffic light because that's the colours of the three parties. Then the other one is the Jamaica coalition, which is the Conservative Union, the Free Democrats and the Greens, called because it makes up the colours of the Jamaican flag. One would see centre-left Social Democrat Olaf Scholz as Chancellor. One would see centre-right Christian Democratic Unionist Armin Laschet as Chancellor, or perhaps anybody else who the party picks. How it would affect the relationship with China with either at the helm, it wouldn't, basically. We're going to see a continuation of what we've seen. It would more likely change domestic policy, particularly when it comes to things like taxes here in Germany and taxes on Germans. So when it comes to how Germany's policy towards China will change, it is still going to be that whole one of Germany remains as a major part of the world community. We stand against China when China does bad things, and we'll sign those statements to say they've done the bad things, but they will not uncouple from China at all when it comes to economic ties whatsoever, because those economic ties are worth billions and billions and billions, and they're only increasing. Absolutely.
And that's there's a lot of the divide here between China and the U.S. in the battle over Europe, which is a weird way to put it, but in the long run, one of our major blocks of allies, our largest set of allies, I would say right now. And maybe not positionally, but just in terms of obviously the population, the size, legitimacy of their governments, that kind of thing. The battle over China, it's already going in its own way. They've already sided. They'll side with both for as long as they possibly can, is my reading of the situation.
Oh. Absolutely.
We've got to close it out here.
Berlin's spending a lot of time to make sure that they're the ones right in between Washington and Beijing.
I believe it. Peter, we've got to close it. We're out of time. But Peter Oliver joining us, EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That strongly implies that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to the headlines. Yesterday, in the news, yesterday, in the United States, there were 172,688 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,829 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 103,785 cases per day, a decrease of 24% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 56% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and now 65% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 43,826,849 people across the United States and has killed an unfortunate and senseless 703,362 men, women, and children in this country. Dr. Francis Collins, the director of the National Institute of Health, is planning to announce his resignation today as head of the gigantic research agency and return to his previous job as the director of National Human Genome Research Institute, the Washington Post and Politico reported Monday night. Collins plans to leave by the end of the year. Interesting. I wonder why. Johnson & Johnson said Tuesday that it has asked for the United States Food and Drug Administration to authorize booster shots for its coronavirus vaccine, but has left it up to the FDA and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to decide just who should get those boosters and when they should get them. In national news, U.S. flights of Afghan evacuees will resume after being halted for a small breakout of measles among Afghans. Most of the flights are U.S. airlines flying to military bases in Qatar and Germany. State Department Senior Advisor Harold Coy is resigning from his post with a scathing memo criticizing the Biden administration's use of Trump-era Title 42 as inhumane. Title 42 gives the administration the ability to bar people from entering the country during a health crisis, which Biden is using to deport thousands of migrants without giving them a chance to seek asylum. If I'm not mistaken, Biden has done this more than Trump, despite, all of the heat Trump was getting for stuff like this. Yesterday, the Supreme Court said Washington, D.C. residents are not NOT entitled to a voting member of Congress. The court issued its decision without a hearing, citing a similar case from 2000 that concluded that D.C. does not get this right because it is not technically a state. Taxation without representation. In international news, the Czech Republic signed a $630 million deal to buy a new air defense system for its military from Israel. Specifically, they bought the Spider system, which is made by Israeli state-run company Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, and which would provide protection against aircraft, helicopters, bombers, cruise missiles, and other weapons. A major investigation released this morning has found that French clergy have sexually abused more than 200,000 children, over the past 70 years. Head of the commission, Jean-Marc Sauvé, started the church and has shown, quote, deep, total, and even cruel indifference for years, unquote. Wow. In tech news, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp went down for more than 6 hours yesterday. The company stated that the issue was, quote, due to a configuration change in the router system which cascaded disruptions through the network, unquote. However, many are calling this a cover for a hack, as the whistleblower and former employee of Facebook is set to testify to Congress today. This comes after she leaked thousands of documents to the media, and 60 Minutes aired an interview slamming the tech giant. This also comes after the Wall Street Journal did basically numerous reporting on information and documents that she was released based on Facebook's own studies that were basically buried. Very interesting. In Earth and Science news, the Nobel Prize in Physics has been awarded to scientists from Japan, Germany, and Italy for their research into climate change. Their work models Earth's physical climate and reliably predicts global warming and interplay of disorder and fluctuations in physical systems from atomic to planetary scales. In holiday news, World Teachers Day, National Be Nice Day, and National Get Funky Day. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, I am curious on the reasons that Facebook went down, but I want to jump to this one. A major investigation released this morning has found that French clergy has sexually abused more than 200,000 children over the past 70 years. Head of the commission, Jean-Marc Sauvé, started the church and shown deep, total, and even cruel indifference for years. Now, this puts me in the mind of the Catholic Church issue, right? That had been going on for basically decades. And a member or clergy member used basically their religious, let's say, religious persona as almost being a dodge and a defense from people having clear questions into their behavior. And it's like, it's like, oh, they wouldn't do this. They're men of God, as if that had some kind of relevance on them or not being just human beings. Well, in this particular case, hundreds of thousands of kids over the past 70 years. And the fact that it's been going on for 70 years in and of itself gets across how systemic this particular thing has been going on. That is astonishing. I guess the catch is, are there going to be lawsuits? Are there going to be prosecutions? How are they going to go back over the years and figure out what took place? And even, are they going to hold people responsible who were aware of it but didn't do anything about it as those kids were going through this pipeline of abuse over the decades? It's good that they brought out the information and the investigation, but why should it have taken 70 years for this to come to fruition? It's appalling, to put it mildly.
Yeah, maybe it is 100% appalling. It's not the only reason I say maybe is that the scrutiny seems to have started a lot more recently, at least like the outright, okay, we're going to talk about this. This is going to become a big thing. And then from when that starts, you want to make sure there's an actual investigation in place, which makes, it's going to take some time. But the idea that there's, sexual abuse going back multiple generations, I know that growing up, people in my personal family who were Catholics, raised Catholic, and then it came out later that a lot of them had been molested. Yeah. And had developed long-term problems from that. And, some of them were not just gay, but like some of the people who had been molested didn't end up just being gay, but like kind of dangerously getting into the community and doing a bunch of drugs and having a bunch of promiscuous sex. And when you talk to them, what it works out to is, they have childhood trauma. Yeah. And they're leaning on that. They're leaning into it, whatever. They're trying to work that out in some way.
Like difficulty reconciling that stuff.
One quick correction here. I was a little bit preoccupied, but Austin mentioned that you accidentally, it's stated, not started, I'll read this again. Head of the commission, Jean-Marc Sauvé, I believe it's pronounced, stated the church had shown, quote, deep, total, and even cruel indifference for years, quote unquote.
I said started.
He said started. He did not start the Catholic Church.
My bad.
I believe that would be Jesus Christ. I think he's officially the one who would thought to have started it.
Jesus is totally responsible for all of this.
No, that's another level.
Too harsh. Too strong.
They got a Catholic in the control room who just took his hat off, and there's some anger there.
It's in good fun. Austin is good.
Oh my God, that's his God, man.
It's like, how dare you, sir? How dare you?
That is. Yeah.
The other one that's interesting, the State Department. So this has been very wild, the immigration issue. Because we've had this situation where Democrats spent 3 years going after Trump on any and everything associated with immigration. And look, some of that stuff was fair game. I mean, Trump's lawyers arguing that not having soap or not having, feminine products is still a situation of hygienic environment. Some of that stuff was utterly absurd. So fair enough. By the same token, the American public, for the most part, backed Trump on this. This was the catch. Democrats were in the minority on this kind of basic issue of securing the border and everything else. The public was like, well, yeah, the border should be secure. You should know who's coming into your country. And the public was roundly for this notion of maintaining some level of border security. Well, the catch becomes when you go too far with that, and when what you're doing and what your rulings are come across as being somewhat racist as opposed to in the best interests of or let's say good faith immigration processes. All right, Trump is gone. Now we have Biden. And we have, 10,000, 12,000 Haitian immigrants. And those Haitian immigrants were basically kicked out of the country as rapidly and as fast as possible. And yeah, using Title 42 to basically prevent many of them from seeking asylum. And keep in mind, the country that they were being sent back to, many of them had been in for years, because many of them had lived in like South America for years. And what they were being sent back to was a country that was in disrepute. It was in political chaos. The president had just been murdered by what seemed to be a hit squad with certain associations with the U.S. and Colombia, et cetera. And not to mention the gangs, not to mention the deep, unabiding poverty and corruption. And we were basically kicking those people out and sending them back to the spot without hearings for asylum. Even with the hearings for asylum, though, what did Susan Pye? She said like 3 to 5% or 3 to 10% of the people who basically apply get accepted. But the asylum process takes like a decade, which means that the people who basically end up in the country could be in this country for years before 90% find out they're going to get kicked out and sent back to their own.
And so then what happens to the 90 to 97% of people who don't receive asylum, but have been living here for years, maybe decades? That's the system that we create.
And it makes no sense.
My mind goes to, I know these are hopeless generalities, Jamarl, but my mind goes to the larger things that I'd like to bring up when we talk about this kind of thing. For one thing, immigration means cheap labor for business. And people left and right agree on that in the States. What complicates things is that a couple of decades back, America pivoted from manufacturing things locally to manufacturing things overseas, specifically in East Asia. So we went to where the labor was cheaper, which is East Asia, China at its rise. You know, big country we can set up trade agreements with, that kind of thing. So we do it. They start to produce stuff. We don't have as much need for cheap labor at home, so we start to get iffy on the immigration thing a little bit more. Republicans have reason to get it. Look at all these jobs going overseas, going to immigrants immigrating into our country, and they have their point. They're in their own way. I don't, when they take it in certain directions, I start to disagree with them. Because, you could have enough business going around, so to speak, that there are jobs both for local immigrants and for everybody who is a native to the country, whatever, and for people overseas. Theoretically, if you had a truly booming business environment, you could get everything done. But we don't, admittedly. And so as far as their points go, I think they're accurate. But where does that leave our immigration policy? If we had a melting pot, partly because there was this vast expanse of unclaimed territory and unclaimed opportunity, business opportunity, that America was able to leverage for hundreds of years of its growth through this melting pot cultural environment and all this mass immigration that we were wanting people to do. We could have cheaper and cheaper labor locally.
Bring us your tired and huddle masses.
Exactly. And we'll put them to work and we'll give them a dream that they can retire with a family and a couple of kids someday, that kind of thing. That dream has been viable. It's just in the last couple of generations that it started to get less and less viable as our leaders have tried to walk down multiple roads at once. Whether it's American imperialism, this free trade approach using manufacturing based overseas, or this more nativistic, a little bit more right-leaning, in a weird way, if we stop the overseas thing, this is a truly going out on a limb, and this is where I get speculative, and everything I said, you'll probably disagree with. You'll focus on this part, even though you agreed with a lot of the stuff I was saying. I could see, and this is where I'm trying to be interesting, I could see if we go back to the isolationist approach, if we push away from a lot of our global responsibilities or whatever, we stop paying for all of our bases overseas and all the military personnel that we have deployed in every corner of the world, and we pivot back to the States, and we bring manufacturing back to the States, and we do all that, I could see Republicans starting to like immigrants more because actually there are a lot more opportunities for them. It's not like this. There was racism and bigotry. We were talking about Catholicism. For a while there was bigotry against Catholics immigrating to the United States, partly
that's right,
due to like anti-Eastern European and anti-Italian. It was tied into racism against various European immigrants. But
Kennedy
over
was
time,
president. All sorts of pressure was on Kennedy about being a Catholic.
Yeah, but we came together. We were able to work through those things. Overall, those grievances are still buried beneath the surface, but it's not like an acute thing that really gets people killing each other these days, rioting like it used to in some cases. That's faded out. Why? Because there was opportunity and the immigrants used it. If we had that opportunity again, I could see there being a turn from the right even, where suddenly instead of being anti-immigrant, it's not as much of a dispute. I don't know if that's the way for America, but I'm just putting that out there.
I don't know if I disagree with that. I mean, the moment that you get a situation where business interests is not being kicked, meaning if you think of all the factory work that used to be in the United States and this kind of economic engine and production and everything else, and if that is being kicked out of the country and the country gets into more financialization, then the need for immigrants for many of those jobs, of course, just goes down naturally because you're basically putting the money into the home countries of wherever the people are that you're getting the products from. But if you had this situation where you started to focus back on American industry, build things here and everything else, again, I don't necessarily know how that would work, especially since you're paying people a quarter or a fifth or sixth of what you would be paying them in the United States, which would mean it would be an increase in the cost of prices. Like, for example, the only reason Walmart works is because you're getting that stuff from somewhere else where they can pay those people dirt cheap prices, in which case you bring, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, so I don't necessarily think that's entirely wrong. I mean, we still need immigration for things like some of the work and labor that Americans don't like to do. So being out in the fields and, plucking or picking cotton. I don't know if picking cotton is the right word for it. That feels somewhat racist. But you get my point. It's certain jobs that Americans basically balk at doing, in which case they usually bring immigrants in to do them. But yeah, I think I agree with the notion that if there was a political incentive and a fiscal incentive for companies to basically pay their political leaders to allow more immigration into the country, that they would allow more immigration into the country and the party would sweeten up to that. Yeah, I think you would probably get a demarcation point between certain factions of the party that are just belligerent against immigrants and other factions of the party, especially the business interests, that would be far more lax on that issue and coming up with laws for immigration and everything else. Yeah, I can agree with that. I think I can agree with that mostly.
That's the general point. And yeah, like you were saying, let's go out into our break. Yeah. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we will be speaking with Peter Coffin, talking about these Facebook revelations from this whistleblower, kind of revisiting the conversation Jamarl and I were having, I'm sure, in some other form. Back earlier this morning about 7:10 a.m. Eastern, we started to talk about this. We'll be coming back to talking about Facebook, talking about what's next with big tech, the precedent that's getting set legally for managing these companies, how this is all going to work out. Like we were saying earlier, these are new beasts, 15 years old, 10 years old in some cases. A lot of these big tech platforms, we're trying to figure out how to handle it. Our culture is trying to figure out how to handle it. We'll be talking about it with Peter Coffin on the other side of this short break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want to record it.
Let's talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. Joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. And if you guys were with us earlier, first thing in the morning, we had this conversation basically on Facebook. This conversation was being driven by a Facebook whistleblower, former Facebook project manager, Francis Hagen, who basically took all sorts and made copies of research done internally by Facebook itself. And much of that research was basically showing that rage and disinformation was profitable, and Facebook knowingly basically used that in order to create a platform that was somewhat hateful for all intents and purposes. And that the incentives of the platform basically lended itself to go in that direction in order to continue or get people to have that much more engagement with the site. This is basically monetized reality. And we're going to have a talk about it. Joining us is Peter Coffin, perfect person to have this conversation. He's a video essayist with over 250,000 YouTube subscribers, podcaster, and author. In their book, Custom Reality and You, they explore how reality works in a world where profit is the driving force. Relatable humor and a commitment to everyday people keeps their left perspective fresh, fun, and most importantly, sharp. Peter, again, perfect person to talk about this with. How you doing today?
Good. How about yourself?
So far, so good. Not doing too bad today. So tell me, just as an overview and as a starter question, what did you think about her 60-minute interview, about Frances Hagan's 60-minute interview and the things that she was basically saying, meaning Facebook did its own research, and it's not that they were trying to be malicious. It wasn't that they were evil or anything like that. It was more so just the incentives and trying to keep people on the site longer and keep them more engaged with the site lended itself towards giving them content and information that would get them riled up and get them angry. And some of this went along the lines of disinformation. And despite what Facebook has been saying all of these years of, oh, we're trying to do this, we're trying to do that, the reality of it is that they basically knew what their site was doing to the fabric of our society. What are your thoughts?
Well, my first reaction was, of course they did. Like, I wrote a book about it.
Right. That was like your perfect person to talk to.
A big meme that kind of came out of, for a brief period of time among people who watch my content and read my book, is attention is currency in the marketplace of ideas. You can hear that said in so many different ways in this interview and a lot of the articles. She's testifying in front of Congress today. She said things like their bottom line depends on provoking a strong emotion to keep us engaged, often incentivizing the most inflammatory and polarizing voices to the point where finding a common ground no longer feels possible. The core of that sentence right there is keep us engaged. They need our attention. That's the whole point. The more time you spend on there, the more angry you get, or whatever emotion. They could get you to feel sadness as long as it's something that keeps you coming back for more information. It doesn't really matter. It's just that anger tends to work better. So, just from an incentive point of view, to me, it seems completely obvious. Like, I've heard multiple people saying, well, this is Facebook putting profits in front of people. And it's like, well, yes, they're a company in an economic system that is built to do that. Like every company does that. It's just that they happen to be monetizing reality itself, you know?
See, I'm of two minds on this one, Peter, and I'll try to lay it all out. These are my biases because I see sort of two debates that, like, when I start to have one, it impedes my ability to have the other. But assuming we're all good faith here, of course, which I know we are, I'll just lay it out. On the one hand, tech companies having their own incentives, their own profit motives that distort human behavior and make us more, whatever it is, whether it's greedy, envious, angry, just vicious in different ways, more emotionally stunted in our ways of relating to one another. There are different ways of talking about this. The idea that that's a distortion and that distortion is a problem, that's a complete conversation ready to go right there. That's a packaged one. Then there's this other one, which is there's a pushback taking place in Congress with some people on the left and other people on the right, some Republicans, some Democrats, saying either tech companies should suppress more information or they should suppress less. And that information, and that, what's the opposite of suppress in this case? It might not be not suppress. It might be like motivate or amplify. In other words, on the one case, Facebook has a profit motive to get everybody arguing about COVID vaccines, for instance. Take that just as an example. They want that to happen because a lot of people are going to stay on their platform to have that argument because people care about it. And it's a big thing for them. On the other hand, Congress really doesn't want them to have that argument. They want, specifically one side of Congress really wants there to be by the book. These are the facts in terms of the news stories you're putting out, in terms of what people are allowed to share. We have a set of rules, ideas, treatments, things you're supposed to say, and we want people saying those things. And I get why they're doing that. But my point is, in Congress, there's this push back and forth between should Facebook be doing more to control user behavior, information, that kind of thing, or less. And in that context, in that debate, I'm more like a little bit skeptical of this whistleblower coming out and complaining about misinformation and bullying, because bullying to one person could just be debating to another, and misinformation to one person could just be your latest news to another person. You know what I mean? I distrust central arbiters deciding for the public, for us, on either end, either what to motivate, what to amplify in terms of anger, or what to suppress in terms of conversation and information. Peter, you see what I'm saying there? I can sort of come to it from two different angles. I don't know which one's the right one to have, but that's my take.
I completely agree with that. I am from the perspective that We should not be restricting people's speech. That is. I'm completely with you on that. But I think that the answer to the question is right there. There is a central organization that has a lot of control over what people see on the Facebook platform, and it's Facebook. And what it is, it's not necessarily that they are censoring information. I mean, they do censor information, and that is a problem. But they also push information. Like, they have systems that find the most inflammatory version of whatever you're saying and make sure that, because that's getting engagement, that's the one that more people see. To me, that is a problem that needs to be addressed. They should not be simply like pushing information based on the amount of engagement it gets. That is like if suddenly like science operated on like, oh my, we did this study with like 12 subjects. We studied 12 people, which is a very small sample size, but like tons of people are interested in this study. So like that makes it more true. Like that's not how science works. That's not how information should be spread. So what I would say is that the issue here is using boosting and amplification and algorithmic sorting to, in some ways, disincentivize the more boring true information rather than censoring it. You end up with this pushing of information that is inflammatory. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. And that, to me, if you address the mechanism that is simply operating off engagement, you suddenly address like a massive amount of the problem that I would say Congress would probably like to address by simply censoring what they deem misinformation. And I think that ultimately I would definitely trend towards let's try to address this algorithm in terms of how it interprets information and spreads it, rather than let's try to just outright censor people. I am not for censorship in any way, shape, or form. I think that a lot of the problem here is it's algorithmic and it's in what they're boosting. I can say something that is entirely true on Twitter, for instance, and I do fairly often, and it doesn't get anywhere, like, because it's not generating engagement. It's just something that nobody wants to hear because it's true.
Well, therein lies the problem, though, right? I mean, Facebook has never considered itself a paragon of virtue or truth. And from the standpoint of this kind of economic system, well, Facebook is like any other company that seeks to maximize its profit. It's just in this case, it maximizes profit off of finding either disinformation or things that makes you angry or sad or hostile, et cetera, et cetera. How does that work in that system? I mean, because what Facebook is doing may be unethical, but it's not necessarily against the law. And are they really going to take action? And for that matter, can Congress push them to take action that basically undermines their own profitability as a company? I mean, there are multiple strands, I guess, that are kind of in conflict with this particular issue. There's this notion of a business and the business model of the company itself. There's this notion of whether it's ethical to basically put out disinformation that gets people killed. Even this notion of engagement of people's emotions in order to get them riled up to have conversations about it, and whether that's even against the law. Not to mention any item or any method that Facebook takes in order to try to curb that data or curb that information on some way puts them at odds with this notion of Section 230, making them far more into the language of being a publisher as opposed to a platform. Like, all of these things seem to be kind of in a knife fight in a phone booth over this particular issue. How does that work? And what's the balance of that? Meaning, how do you mend the gap, or how do you mend those various jagged edges?
I think the way that I would err is towards the state ultimately finding some way to work in favor of Facebook. I think Facebook is a private entity. It's owned by people who are looking to make profit. That is the central, like, the fundamental contradiction of capitalism is socialized production and the preservation of the feudal mode of appropriation, meaning the private ownership of the product and profit. So, and the state itself exists to maintain the contradiction between classes So what I would ultimately say, if you sort of follow the very basic, like, Marxist points on this, my guess is that the currents in Congress will negotiate something with Facebook that ultimately preserves the algorithms as they are, because ultimately the point is to make money. That's the point of everything in capitalism. Do I think that it might have to pull back on it for a while people sort of forget this is going on? Maybe. But, like, if you remember, like, a few years ago when sponsored content was first becoming a big thing with influencers on these various social platforms, there was a big thing about, like, creating laws where people had to disclose that they were doing sponsored content. And you know, for like a year, people had to do that. But I don't see people doing that anymore. There's not really a lot of talk about that. Like, sometimes you'll hear somebody say, this content is sponsored by Facebook, or they'll do like a Raid Shadow Legends ad read or something. But, like, a lot of the time there's content that it sort of conceals the fact that it is an ad of some kind. So, to me, whatever they end up doing here, it has to be more for show and more for assuaging the public interest. Because I ultimately believe that even though there may be individual actors in Congress that think, oh, well, we need to fix this, we need to change this, the interests of the body as a whole is ultimately facilitating it. That's my belief, anyhow.
Well, but here's I think where you and I are going to run into some disagreement, because I think that you're seeing this primarily as Facebook trying to make a profit, whereas I've seen a lot of the conversation here. Admittedly, Facebook's going to try to do what Facebook's going to try to do, but and I'm worried about getting into like the classic capitalism versus Marxism debate. Not that I'm a capitalist necessarily, but just like having that debate, because that has been done to death so many times. But a lot of the things underneath it, a lot of the foundations of that argument would apply here too. I'll say this. Yes, Facebook's trying to make a profit motive, but the state's trying to control the public because it's in the state's best interest to try to do so on this one. You know, they see a pandemic rising. They feel the urge to try to control the public's response to it in some way to make the pandemic go better for them, so they can retain the mandate of heaven or whatever, so they can retain the eyes of the legitimacy in the eyes of the public, that kind of thing. But they're doing it so bunglingly with the pandemic specifically that it's not working, and they're using Facebook, just sticking to, the COVID misinformation, disinformation, conversation. They're using Facebook and any social media platform that people use as social media to try to control what the public says to itself so that they can manage the pandemic better. It's not, maybe there's a bottom line technically in that they want, investment bankers to keep lining their pockets in a functioning United States government going forward. In a broad sense, they're looking for that. But it's also the state seeking to enrich itself and strengthen itself. And I would argue that nationalize Facebook for a second, go down that road, pretend that it's all being done purely out of social interest or public interest, the pursuit of that. With the current leadership, whatever that looks like, I would see them doing the same kinds of things and having these same kinds of conversations. Well, should we try to get people to argue with each other, in which case they'll maybe learn more? Or is that going to turn into bullying and hate speech? And is that going to turn into driving divisive emotions? Like, these are difficult problems for anybody to look at. And I would argue that our government has had more of an influence on what Facebook chooses to do with those questions than Facebook's profit motive, although that's a sort of constant. But suppressing information specifically, what people are really getting pissed about in recent years, why Facebook had to promote its own likability to its users through its newsfeed recently, where Zuckerberg came out and said that apparently, it's because Facebook is doing this stuff not out of its own profit interest. It would be showing people more like cat videos or something. It's because the government keeps hitting them for it. And I would argue a lot of people in the media sphere keep driving these stories out of political allegiance, hitting Facebook for not doing more to control this stuff. That's my take, though, Peter. What do you think in response?
Well, I think that ultimately you're talking about like a large sector of the private or a large area of the private sector, big pharma, and their interests versus the interests of Facebook, and those things coming up in real conflict here. What Facebook is doing is undermining a large section of capital's interests, and the state, as it is interested in building its own power and regulating and in many cases facilitating all of this, it does have to work in some way to reconcile these two interests. Like, this is our primary reality driving engine, I guess, and this is what we're relying on to handle this pandemic. How do we reconcile these two things? And this is, I think, where ultimately I do think the state will facilitate Facebook, but I do think that they might err on the end of censorship. There may be laws that get passed that are on the edge of censorship, which is, like you said, it's very possible that the government, if they were in control of this, might be having the same argument. Like, do we employ these same types of algorithms? Do we do this stuff? And ultimately, they might. I don't know. I can't answer that one way or the other. I could say that they would probably be slightly different algorithms if the state had been in control the whole time, because their motives would obviously be different.
They'd be asking different questions. They'd be asking the same questions. They might be coming up with different answers, though. But I guess my point is the problems that they would, these conversations, those would come back up. Those would still be there.
Absolutely. But I think that ultimately, it sucks. I think ultimately these algorithms are not going to be the things that are addressed in whatever law is passed. And I do think that it probably will err on the side of censorship. I don't think that, I think that if they do, and this is an if they pass a law, I think it will trend towards censorship rather than addressing these algorithms, because I don't think that the state wants to answer those types of questions, because that would, A, impede Facebook, and B, I don't think the state has relevant information. Like, they could describe all of this stuff to the state, but they could describe everything to the outside world, and it still wouldn't completely give a picture of what's going on inside Facebook. Like, you and I don't know completely what's, like, we've gotten all of these leaks, we've got information that's certainly informing our opinions towards this, but I'm willing to bet that is far more complicated.
100%. Yeah, no, we only get what we can get. But I'm also, anytime one of these leaks comes out, I'm in the camp where I'm like, is this a psyop? What's going on here, man? Who drove this leak? What agenda is this supposed to push? I'm incredulous about it. Not necessarily the content, but of the leak, but the motivation. And of course, how you frame the content of a leak is going to change dramatically how you, what you think about its contents, how you judge the actual package that you're reading here. But the timing of this, why is this coming out right now? And who is this going to benefit? Well, who this is going to benefit are people in Congress who are pushing for more control over what Facebook, are trying to get Facebook to take more control, really. They want more control so that Facebook, they can exert that control by making Facebook control what other people are allowed to post and do on these platforms. Simply put, for better and for worse. Whether it's not getting not driving people to see posts that will make them irrationally angry and therefore likely to leave angry comments that are, that qualify as bullying, that kind of thing. That's technically controlling people's behavior. It's just, should we be doing that? And that's where, Jamarl, earlier on last hour in the show, you were trying to get me, where should you draw the line? You were trying to get me to answer this question, like bite the bullet. What should, what's acceptable free speech?
Yes.
That's where that comes down. Because any given instance here, if we're just saying we want to end bullying on Facebook, well, if people are liable to take any debate as bullying, if people are liable to take any form of hard argumentation
it's very fudgy.
as bullying, then all of a sudden it gets very fudgy. Yeah. And I don't trust some AI fed on people's complaints to necessarily make the best decision any more than I trust some random 23-year-old that Facebook hires from this company to judge, any given comment. You know what I'm saying? These outside firms that they'll rely on to basically arbitrate any given dispute over, okay, is this content, should this be allowed, should that not be allowed? I don't trust any of the relevant parties to make the right decision, which is why my general thing is more laissez-faire. Let people use these platforms freely, because I don't trust the arbiters here. Peter, what's your take?
I want less arbiters. That's ultimately where I want. I want to see less of the AI control. I want to see less of the these people who they bring in to make these types of consulting decisions, who get these bizarre trainings that are telling them that every single possible thing. I don't know if you've ever seen any of the corporate trainings on what qualifies as bullying or what qualifies as various diversity and inclusion violations, but some of them are really bizarre and frankly insane, and somebody who doesn't have a lot of life experience and watches these things comes in right out of college and does one of these jobs, they're operating a very rigid set of rules that is not necessarily based in reality or understanding context. So my want, sincerely, is for there to be less artificial intelligence making these decisions and less of these just sort of like outside firms that have no like context. Like, we need to have people who understand what's going on, not only in Facebook but in society. But we ultimately really want to divide that labor out to somebody who is just like, you pay attention to this type of thing and you do this type of thing. But it's unfortunate because I don't think that we really view society in that way. I don't think that most of these companies really want like some sort of like person with a lot of, who's plugged into the news, who's plugged into online communities, who's watching various things going on. I think that they want to kind of divide the labor and have people do very specific things and relieve themselves of various liabilities.
You're talking about like having a generalist who's kind of aware of things that are going on either in the media, history, science, etc., to basically make decisions on the things that come up.
I think that like we need people to make those decisions because logically speaking, like in the type of society that we have right now, we do need to know where that line is. You said, I think, the last time I was on, what is yelling fire in a movie theater?
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a question that has like a ton of contextual implications that I think that AI is completely unequipped to make, and that the types of people that they bring into these things, they intentionally bring in people who have very specific viewpoints.
Yes,
right.
Are beneficial to them in X way. And I think that that's a big problem.
It's like the person you're hiring. You already know the perspective of the person that you're hiring and you're putting into that position.
You're hiring them to come in and give you a specific recommendation.
This is a complicated thing for me. The reason why I was pushing Shane on trying to be like, all right, where's the line? Because invariably, anywhere the line is, there's going to be problems with it. Like it's so much of a fudgy situation. It's so subjective in many respects. What does it mean to be bullying? Or what does it mean to be disinformation? Even that, what does it mean to be disinformation? I mean, sometimes they can use conversations that are in no way disinformation and put it under the language of disinformation. I think the thing we should be clear on, though, this is not a situation where there's no hand on the wheel. There is a hand on the wheel. The hand on the wheel is Facebook. And what it shows people and what it gives people is giving them certain impressions, certain feelings, certain things in order to create engagement. That's the beginning and end of it. Where it's like, look, how do we get more people engaged and stay on the site longer? What's her name? Frances Hagan. That was kind of her key point, and that was probably the thesis of her. Well, what is going to be taking place in Congress, and definitely what she was making the point about 60 Minutes. She had a friend of hers that apparently died from misinformation that was taking place on, I guess, some social media network. And from that point on, her thing was, I want to combat misinformation. When she got the job for Facebook, this was based around, I believe, the January 6th stuff, where her point was, during the election, when Facebook figured out, all right, there's been no coups, there's been nothing weird, there's been no riots, all good. Let's get rid of the information that we were using, or let's get rid of the systems that we were using to basically tap down on misinformation. And she makes the point and alludes to January 6th as being associated with that. I guess for me, the issue becomes down to human psychology. Like, if there are studies and if there's research into how human beings engage these devices, it's like the radio during the First World War or the Second World War. Well, okay, you had Hitler giving his propaganda, and you had FDR giving fireside chats. Both of those things were going to have an effect on the person that is listening to it, especially with the new technology. And each basically had the same effect, meaning you were able to influence the behavior and tenor of the people who were listening to it, especially when those people had basically zero defenses for the information that they were being given. Well, I think this is kind of the same thing that we're stuck with Facebook. How do human beings engage systems that provide them with information about a certain point of view of the world and that are done to engage emotions intentionally? And what effect does that have? I mean, I guess the catch is, how do you make laws around that, though? I mean, that gets very, very difficult to pull off. And any law that they make for it probably is going to be held for all of the platforms, not just Facebook. And tell me if you think I'm wrong on that.
Well, like I said, my personal belief is that they should be addressing the algorithms rather than the content, because I don't think, and do I think that this is how it's going to play out? Probably not.
But the algorithm is the content.
Ultimately.
I mean, the algorithm basically is just pulling content. It's dealing with one, deals with the other. They're linked. They're intrinsically linked.
Well, I would agree with that. But, like, if you have an algorithm that isn't favoring the emotional and argumentative content specifically to generate engagement, yeah, your engagement's going to go down. And this is why I don't think this is what will be addressed, because ultimately it's how the money is made. And I think that they'll just censor certain types of content. But it's my opinion that they at least need to tone that down. Like, I think if it were in public control, like genuine public control, where there were a democratic vote on what Facebook were to do, and you described exactly what algorithms were doing, like, it doesn't matter if it's true or if it's false, it will be boosted by this platform in order to create argument, in order to maintain attention, in order to create division that can be exploited for profit. I think that people would go, well, we need to cut that out. I don't like that. But I think that that's not what's going to be the ultimate question here. I think the ultimate question is, what types of information should we allow? And I think that that's what the government is probably going to be addressing.
Interesting. Well, let me ask you this. If, let's say for the moment, that the algorithm wasn't intentionally finding rage and so forth as a way of operating, or as a business operation, should they go after the content in that situation? Meaning, I guess, because what it sounds like you're saying is basically the issue here is not that people put whatever they put on. So it's a social media network. You're going to get all sorts of people saying all sorts of things. The issue is that the negative content, and I'll just use negative content as a adjective for it, is the thing that is being boosted for profitability's sake. It doesn't make sense. There's a difference in those things. It's like, yes, if you have people writing whatever they want, and people may not gravitate towards the worst aspect of the content, but the fact that the algorithm basically gives them that basically brings that to prominence. If you get rid of the algorithms doing that, then you have less of an issue with censorship, meaning you have less of a need to keep or tamp down certain content because the public wouldn't necessarily gravitate towards that content. Or tell me if I'm wrong. I'm trying to understand the difference in those things.
No, that's exactly what I'm arguing. I think that you would definitely need less oversight over content if you weren't boosting the most inflammatory content. But I also don't think that's what they'll ultimately address, unfortunately.
Okay, that makes sense.
I almost want them to boost the most inflammatory content. I feel like what people could do with is a little bit more shock, and I'll be in a weird way. I don't know, man. A little bit more shock or outrage, or like what real actual debate, really like talking to people. I don't, because I'm the same thing with Instagram. Instagram directing, making girls feel Instagram is toxic for girls. The wave of articles when we were talking about this totally happens, but also. It's like, I think of a nomadic tribe moving into new territories, new ecological zones where they're having to confront new plants and animals. Okay, we've discovered this new territory. Now let's figure out how to live here. And maybe there's some beautiful things. Maybe we'll discover some new fruits, some beautiful views, vistas, those kinds of things. Admittedly, it's a silly metaphor, but the idea that we have these new technologies that allow us to do new things. And what we need to do is learn how to use them, learn how to personally deal with the stresses that these new tools afford you in terms of, okay, my body image isn't what I thought it was. I'm confronted with all these people who make themselves really attractive, and I need to confront that. These issues in myself. Either I need to accept myself or change myself, or some combination of the two. Same thing. There are all these people who disagree with me and are acting like jerks. Now, what do? Do I run away? Do I try to engage peacefully? Do I try to find the people who are in the middle of that line? Like, these are just human dynamics. In one sense, this is nothing new at all. But on the other hand, the rate at which we're being barraged with this stuff and the culture that we have dealing with it, it's like, I don't know, man. I feel like we could learn how to use these tools in a much more fruitful way instead of being constantly nannied around. You're going to get bullied. You're going to get body shamed, whatever. And therefore you just quit. That seems like a bit of a bipolar withdrawing from the situation. Not to seriously denigrate bipolar, but it seems you're going to an extreme to pull out of this situation when what you might benefit the most from is just, figuring out how to work with it. We got to close. We're over time, Peter, but thoughts on that?
Well, I think ultimately, it's not. I agree with you on that. I think that that's true. But the inflammatory posts that we're talking about, the bullying, the misinformation, these things would just be like a normal part of the conversation if they weren't being boosted. It wouldn't be the constant, like, top conversation at all times. And that, I think, is much closer to how a human dynamic would be. Whereas now, currently, it's like the platform is pushing those things specifically. I think if it wasn't pushing those things specifically, I completely agree with you. Like, we just need to kind of learn how to exist in society. Like, there's going to be elements of everything in everyone's experience. It's just that, you know, on these platforms, like, misinformation is, and I'm not making a judgment here as to what misinformation is, but let's say misinformation is a huge thing, and let's say this bullying is a huge thing. It's a constant on these platforms.
Maybe, but I'm encountering a dearth of misinformation, and I can't remember the last time I got seriously bullied. I could do with a good bullying. It's been a decade or so. No, I'm just kidding. But no, we've got to. And admittedly, somebody who would like take that to who would get bullied and then go to kill themselves. I don't want them to. That's another conversation that I'm having, and I don't want to take it too seriously as if I'm trying to represent for everybody. But there's something else there. Regardless, Peter, thanks for talking with us this morning.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. That was Peter Coffin, video essayist, over 250,000 YouTube subscribers, also a podcaster and an author. In their book, Custom Reality and You, Peter explores how reality works in a world where profit is the driving force. Follow Peter on YouTube, Patreon, and Twitter at Peter Coffin. Also purchase their book on Amazon. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we're briefly taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. I hope you have your phone at handy. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And let's go to Tarif. Again, 202-521-1320. Tarif calling in from New Orleans. You're on the line. What's on your mind?
Comments. First, I'd like to say free Julian Assange, free Danny Ginger, hands off Haiti. My first comment is dealing with the Panama Papers. You don't see you don't see Western politicians in that paperwork, but what you do see is people like the King of Jordan is in that files and things like that.
Tony Blair?
Jordan,
Tony Blair?
Well, Tony Blair, yeah, but mainly I forgot about him. Thanks, Jamal. Well, I forgot about him, but mainly like people like I remember at one time they were trying to have an Arab Spring in Jordan. So Jordan on the western front, on the western eyes, he's on the fence with certain countries in the West. So you got to be careful with the Panama Papers. The second comment is dealing with the debt ceiling. The best thing, when I've been over the years looking at, is best to go into default. The reason being, if you go into default, it will force the manufacturers back to the United States. And we'll use the manufacturing infrastructures to make our dollar work something, because as long as the U.S. constantly printing money, we got to somehow unload debt on other countries. And these other countries, what they're doing is they're clicking together and they're working together like the AU, the ASEAN, the SCO. You got these other organizations, and they're not allowing the U.S. to unload the debt on them. So if the Biden administration or any other administration is going to keep on raising the debt ceiling, that means, from what I understand, we got to become parasites and constantly push the debt on other nations. But these other nations becoming hip to this, right? So you only can go so far by pushing the debt up. So the best thing is to let the money default, Of course, we're going to go through hard times. We're just going to become a regional power instead of a global power. But at least we'll be manufacturing like Fords, Chevys, and Dodges. And
I will be honest, Tarif, I've had this same thought process. I've gone back and forth with myself on this one. And thankfully, I haven't had this conversation too many times publicly on air, because if you're going to bite bullets, this is one of those bullets that's when you bite it, it's pretty painful. The idea, Biden said this just yesterday. Pardon me, it might have been the day before. No, it was yesterday. Basically, the reserve status of the dollar as the world's currency would come under question if we were to raise the debt ceiling. If we were to push this off, we weren't to do this, basically, theoretically, could collapse. That idea, selling other countries our debt, exporting our debt, that model as our currency, that's tied into globalism, that's tied into, the fact that we haven't been producing things locally in the States. And yeah, if we wanted to do it, the thing is, Tarif, those hard times would be very hard times. And
you're talking about millions of jobs lost almost immediately, $1 trillion.
Tens of millions.
Just up in smoke. The reserve currency, that's pretty much over with.
That's a part of it. It'd have to be. But then, theoretically, after that, if we weather that storm well enough, on the other side, we might come back even healthier. That's the other side of that. But I understand why a lot of relevant people don't want to bite that bullet.
Also, the amount of debt that we're paying on the money on the debt would increase dramatically. Also, if I'm not mistaken, it's against the law. The full faith and credit of the United States is something that is supposed to be basically protected by Congress.
Man, we treat the law like ticker tape or tissue paper at a toilet
That is true.
Paper parade.
That is true.
Not a ticket paper parade. Anyway, we just run right through it. I wouldn't see that stopping us if we wanted to pull back. And I don't see other countries. I don't know. We would see what happens.
Other countries would lose their mind if we did that. I mean, think of what took place for the financial crash, and think of the damage that the financial crash did to the United States and to the other countries around the world. It didn't stay here, even though it started here.
It depends on how that process all rolls through. But they were talking about this. This was under Trump, his Treasury Secretary, Mnuchin, I believe, was the one who was talking about, okay, well, maybe we want to devaluate the dollar, and actually maybe the dollar shouldn't be the reserve currency. This is now officially in the political Overton window, you know? Mm-hmm. Anyway,
I don't know if it's officially in the Overton window. I mean, even McConnell.
If his Treasury Secretary is talking about it, that's in the Overton window. It's not just Tarif. It's not just me. It's the Treasury Secretary of the United States. That is well inside the Overton window at that point.
Yeah, I
still uncomfortable.
I severely doubt that.
It's toward the edge of it.
I mean,
I would go back and read the quotes.
Yeah, I would need to hear
doubt?
Mnuchin's quote.
Okay.
So that's fair. I need to hear Mnuchin's quote.
Fair enough.
But the overwhelming majority of the people who are in the know on this and who deal with this is not something. I mean, even Mitch McConnell, who's basically using this for the politics of it, is not in the mindset that the United States should default on the debt ceiling. It's a fig leaf. It's something that shouldn't even be there. It's a contradiction with this kind of other law about the full faith and credit of the United States. It's a quirk of Congress. But nevertheless, it's here. And so what I want and what many people want may be irrelevant considering the politics of this stuff.
True. So, slight correction. Mnuchin was pushing for weakening the dollar. He was saying he didn't want to lose it as reserve currency, but he was pushing temporarily for weakening the dollar, which is a push in that direction.
Well, they weaken the dollar with the idea that you can use more money in other countries. So think of as the higher and stronger a particular currency is, well, the currency is more expensive when other people using it, so it makes the products that much more expensive.
Buying those goods from from that country, totally.
So if you weaken the currency, if you weaken the dollar, at that point, it becomes cheaper. Exactly. And so more people may buy the dollar or buy products that were made from America as opposed to other countries.
Well, specifically, it's good for exporting.
Exactly.
If you have a weaker dollar, then you can export more goods more cheaply. You can build up your industry from an actual GDP, looking at the amount of goods produced, not their monetary value, but some sort of abstract quantity of the value of, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
People will buy more. It's cheaper, and so you can build up your industry. And that's why China's been doing it for a long time. We've been hitting them on keeping their dollar weak. They've been artificially devaluating their dollar. We've been crying uncle over that for years now.
But just to be clear, that's different than hitting the debt ceiling. That's not devaluing the dollar. That's basically destroying the dollar.
That's what Biden was saying. That's where that came in. Anyway, we're going to close this hour out. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of this morning show. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this short break.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're live, coming to you from across the divided states of America. It is time now for the third hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am your indefatigable, ever-vigilant, last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are back. It is October 5th. It's just past 9 a.m. Eastern this morning, and it is now time for headlines. First up in COVID stats. Let's get into them. Yesterday in the United States, there were 172,688 new COVID cases reported. That's along with 1,829 new deaths. Despite that sharp peak number of cases yesterday, that leaves us over the past week with an average of about 103,785 cases per day. That's far fewer, a far smaller number. A decrease of 24% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 56% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. Now 65% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 43,827,000 people across the United States. It has killed 703,362 Americans. Dr. Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, that's the NIH, is planning to announce his resignation today as head of the gigantic research agency. He would return to his previous job as the director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, according to the Washington Post and Politico reporting last night. Collins plans to leave the agency by the end of the year. Johnson & Johnson said Tuesday it has asked the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to authorize booster shots for its coronavirus vaccine, but has left it up to the FDA and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to decide just who should get their boosters and when. In national news, U.S. flights of Afghan evacuees will resume after being halted for a small breakout of measles among the Afghans. Most of these flights are U.S. airlines flying to military bases in Qatar and Germany. State Department senior advisor Harold Koh is resigning from his post with a scathing memo criticizing the Biden administration's use of Trump-era Title 42 as quote-unquote inhumane. Title 42 gives the administration the ability to bar people from entering the country during a health crisis, which Biden is using to deport thousands of migrants without giving them a chance to seek asylum. Yesterday, the Supreme Court said Washington, D.C. residents are not entitled to a voting member of Congress. The court issued its decision without a hearing. They cited a similar case from 2000 that concluded that D.C. does not get this right because it is not a state. In international news, the Czech Republic signed a $630 million deal to buy a new air defense system for its military from Israel. Specifically, they bought the Spider system, which is made by the Israeli state-run company Rafael Advanced Defense Systems Limited, and which would provide protection against aircraft, helicopters, bombers, cruise missiles, and other weapons. And a major investigation released this morning has found that French clergy have sexually abused more than 200,000 children over the past 7 years. I saw 330,000 as a high number there. Head of the commission, Jean-Marc Sauve, stated the church had shown, quote, deep, total, and even cruel indifference for years, end quote. In tech news, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp went down for more than 6 hours yesterday. The company stated the issue was, quote, due to a configuration change in the router system, which cascaded disruptions through the network, end quote. However, many are calling this a cover for a hack, as a whistleblower and former employee of Facebook is set to testify to Congress today. This comes after she leaked thousands of documents to the media, and 60 Minutes aired an interview slamming the tech giant, Facebook. In Earth and Science news, the Nobel Prize in Physics has been awarded to scientists from Japan, Germany, and Italy for their research into climate change. Their work models Earth's physical climate and reliably predicting global warming and the interplay of disorder and fluctuations in physical systems from atomic to planetary scales. Cool, sounds pretty complicated. In holiday news, World Teachers Day is today, also National Be Nice Day and National Get Funky Day. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I'm going to read this one again briefly.
National Get Funky Day.
Oh, yeah.
Sounds funny.
It means different things to different people, but I might dance a little bit when I get back to the house. That sounds kind of fun. I want to read this one again. The Nobel Prize in Physics has been awarded to scientists, blah, blah, blah. Their work models Earth's physical climate and reliably predicting global warming, the interplay of disorder and fluctuations in physical systems from atomic to planetary scales.
Yeah.
Now I don't want to like overinflate this.
The atomic part stands out too.
Yeah, but from the level of an atom to the planet, they're trying to depict a physical system. That starts to get complicated. We have big computers, Jamarl, but our computers are not yet big enough to handle that in minute detail. From everything up from the bottom up to the top, that's a lot.
Yeah.
I can just tell you right now, we don't have the ladder in place looking around and talking to people. That's still a ways off. And from getting from literally every atom in a planet to understanding how all those atoms work together on the level of that planet, you know what I mean? That's a lot.
I didn't take it as they were saying every atom in a planet.
No.
I would need to see the research. I mean, they got the prize for it, so
100%.
who knows? They could have come up with some kind of interesting way of trying to do it.
That is probably what that is.
But I would say trying to model that stuff is difficult. I mean, just in general, right? I mean, even when you get in these kind of feedback loops where something interacts with something else that creates this kind of additional thing that pushes forward. I mean, the computer model can only go but so far. It's a model, after all, and how that looks in the real world can be somewhat different.
I've seen them struggle to do like complex fluid dynamics.
Yeah.
I've seen them struggle to do a good 3D simulation of like a tank of water sloshing around.
Yeah.
And they've been working on that one for decades, trying to get a single tank of water, all of the molecules.
That to the planetary scale.
And then expand that to a planetary scale with all these different types of materials. Yeah, it's just my point is I read that very quickly, and some people might get the wrong idea. They might be like, we can do that? We can model our own planet from the level of the atoms all the way up to like Mount Olympus. Sounds implausible to me, and I think you're right. If it sounds implausible to you, it is implausible. That's not exactly what they're talking about. It would be like abstractions, simplified models for tracking the stuff, and you know the way that being able to link the bottom level to the top level, even if a lot of the links are going to be fuzzy and inaccurate or probabilistic in ways where you wouldn't know exactly what's going to happen.
Exactly,
it gives you some idea. You know, different ways that I can envision it. It's not the same as they have a model.
Yeah, right.
That was my
point.
point.
Like we have this atom, and we know exactly what this atom is going to do in this situation.
Exactly.
No, they're just trying to find ways to. Okay, what's ideal in this situation, and can we get closer to reality in the way we try to have these systems interact with one another? And look, it is not easy. Like, you know, taking something like methane, for example, and it's like, okay, well, can the model accommodate the fact of the ice sheets melting? And with the ice sheets melting, more sun or more heat can basically hit the oceans. And when that heat hits the oceans, it's going to warm the oceans. Like, does it take into account all of that stuff, even the feedback mechanisms? Can it take into account global dimming, for example? Meaning whatever the model that they're using at that point, does it take into account, okay, the stuff that we're putting into the atmosphere creates a haze around the planet that cuts down the temperature of the planet by X number of degrees, but the moment that the haze goes away, the temperature spikes. Does it know all that? And can you even program all of that stuff into the model as the model is being created? I mean, oftentimes what they would want the model to do is show them those things, not them having to program those things in. And so, yeah, I don't know. I would have to see the research and everything else. I mean, look, they get the Nobel Peace Prize for it, so they apparently did something right.
Nobel Physics Prize.
Physics Prize. Right? Oh, not Peace Prize. Thank you. Nobel's Physics Prize. So apparently they did something right.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, these things are massively complicated systems in order for them to try to mimic and to mirror. But good for them. I mean, it's something that definitely needs to be done. I've seen them try to do this for planetary formation. I've seen them try to do this for the creation of the galaxy, the cosmos, background radiation, all of this other stuff. And yeah, some of the models can get pretty sophisticated and you know, they put in the dynamics, the equations and everything else. But the modeling of an atom to the planetary scale sounds extremely difficult.
I love it. I'll be honest, it's like I'm not smart enough for it, and I would have had to spend it in my childhood completely differently. But like getting more into computational modeling of complex systems in all sorts of different ways, super fascinating stuff. And for me personally, it kind of comes out. My dad, Lee Stranahan, you know, former host of the show and stuff, he used to teach this 3D animation program. It's called Lightwave 3D.
Well, I saw your dad working on that stuff.
He was, yes, that's more recent, but he used to do this back in the day. He used to basically teach people how to use this, you know, 3D animation. You come up with 3D models, objects, you can transform them in space, you can handle lighting inside the system. You can think of it's like a 3D space that you create stuff inside of. Anyway, more recently he's been working on it with like game engines, kind of a natural outgrowth of this Unreal Engine 4. But it's just this idea. I grew up, you know, traveling around with him. I'd help him teach. I'd help him break the computers down and put them together. I'd use the computers sometimes. And I got into, for a little while, playing around with 3D modeling, 3D animation specifically. animating these 3D objects. It's just cool being able to have a physical space, a conceptual space that you can create anything, that you can do anything you want to. The physics works effectively however you want it to work. I used it to make roller coasters. I used to, inside the 3D space, I'd like have the camera start at point A and go to point B, add in more points, and all of a sudden the camera's zooming around, you know, in between these buildings. I would pretend I could fly, that kind of thing. But the propensity of a system like that to use it in all these different ways, it's a taste. Anybody who plays, literally just plays a game in virtual reality, you get a sense of what that's like. You have this
it's intense,
virtual space. Have you done that before?
Well, your dad, actually. I mean, I've done it more than one occasion. So, Dubai, and the name of the tower eludes me for the moment.
The Burj Dubai?
Burj Dubai, right. Burj Khalifa, I think it's called.
I think you're right. Right.
And so, at the very top of the building where you're, overlooking everything else, they have this virtual reality simulation of a person, kind of like this kind of spy network, where the person is like running from something and then they're outside of the building and then they eventually take the jump off the building. And it feels like your body accommodates what you're seeing and makes it feel like you're actually falling all the way down the building. It's a very weird and heady experience. Your dad also was building that virtual reality thing where you could walk around the room. I think he had a picture of Joseph Stalin in the room or something. I forget why. But it was so just offbeat stuff. But it does feel like you are in that space. And it is easy, very easy to conceptualize this notion of at some point where the signals in your body are being spoofed, where instead of your arm moving, you're paralleling that movement with something in an environment or computational environment. So, it's like, because if you think of it, anything that takes place right now is basically signals going from your brain to the various parts of your body. And oftentimes, before you even do something, even before your brain is aware that you're about to do something, your body has already primed itself to move.
Oh, yeah.
Which, again, is weird. It's something like so deeply ingrained that even before you make the impression to move and before you're even aware that you're about to move, your body has already primed itself to make that movement take place. And so, if you think of a system that can electronically say, okay, he's moving his arm right now, don't let him move his arm in real life, but move it in the machine space. Well, at that point, any movement and everything that you would typically do, you wouldn't even know the difference between the movement outside of a game space versus inside the game space. And the computer can basically pick up all those movements and you can kind of move along as if you were in that space. All of that stuff becomes possible. It seems like the hardest aspect of that would be the visual representation of what reality is and trying to get that visual representation to look like reality itself. But from the standpoint of 3D modeling and everything else, yeah, you can kind of see the pathway or the steps towards getting that to be more sophisticated systems. No, man, that stuff is phenomenal. It's very interesting. And what it pretends 20 years, 30 years. Wow. I mean, you're talking about like a holodeck in some real sense of the word.
Oh, man. I'm going to take us into a break. Slightly early break, but a fascinating conversation. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we'll be speaking with Patrick LeBlanc, professor of economics and finance at the University of Ottawa, talking about the Pandora Papers breaking over the weekend, and from which the world is somewhat still recovering or trying to process all this information that's coming out bigger even yet than the Panama Papers, the previous big batch of papers looking at the private offshore banking used by millionaires and billionaires the world around, taking another harder look at this stuff with an even bigger release. Anyway, we'll be getting into this, what's in the, what people are still processing, of course, the millions of documents being released as a part of this trough, but we'll be getting into it with Patrick when we come back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with the chat, the tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So let's just start here. This is the Washington Post. I'm just going to read the opening because it gives a pretty good summary of what is taking place regarding the Pandora Papers. The Washington Post on Sunday published the first in a series of stories based on more than 11.9 million documents that expose a secretive financial universe that benefits the wealthy and the powerful. The vast trove of documents known as the Pandora Papers was obtained by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ. The Post collaborated the investigation. Collaborated on the investigation, which involves more than 600 journalists in 117 countries and territories, the largest ever organized by the ICIJ. The investigation exposed the offshore system that government leaders, billionaires, and criminals often use to hide their assets. This has been pretty astonishing. What has also been found is that despite the fact that the United States often complains about these offshore accounts and many of these tiny countries that basically use or are haven for these offshore accounts, the United States itself, especially South Dakota, Alaska, have become havens themselves in these kind of places where people can hide their money and the ultra-rich can hide their resources. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Professor of Economics and Finance at the University of Ottawa. He was also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation. We have Patrick LeBlond. Professor Patrick, thank you for joining us. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you.
By the way, am I pronouncing your last name correct? Is LeBlond?
Yeah, LeBlond is fine, yes.
Excellent. So I guess starting off, what are the Pandora Papers and why are the Pandora Papers getting this much buzz and this much level of significance?
Well, as you can imagine, this is not new, right? You mentioned the Panama Papers, or the Paradise Papers before that. These papers, in a way, tell people what we already know. That the rich and famous and not so famous have assets all over the world, and they try to use the available means, some often legal, but also often illegal, to either hide their assets so people don't know that they have those and how much money they have or what is their worth, especially if they occupy political positions. And also to either evade taxes, that is illegally avoid paying taxes on income that they have, or simply, not evade, but avoid in the sense of sometimes stashing or keeping their income in tax havens for a certain time, and legally not pay taxes because, we didn't bring them back to the U.S. They're not declared in the United States yet. They're in some corporation, let's say in the Cayman Islands, and only when we bring back the money to the U.S. Will we have to pay taxes. But in the meantime, obviously, that income accumulates, and it does so without taxes. So in a way, it offers them, let's say, higher returns on their investment, something that, the average person would not have access to because they would have to pay lawyers and tax accountants to set up these shell corporations, et cetera. So it's a big deal. And obviously what makes it an even bigger deal is the names associated with those accounts, right? Politicians, former politicians, well-known people. So, in a way it tells us, it confirms what we already knew. And then it's a question of, okay, what do we do about it?
Okay, a couple questions here to follow up, and thank you for joining us. For one thing, is there any regulatory agency in charge of naming these things and making them all alliterative? Because we have the Pandora Papers, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, all basically the same types of papers. I'm kidding mostly. But comparing the three, what's significant about this? It seems like, just if I literally look at the numbers, 11.9 million leaked documents for the Pandora Papers, this most recent batch. The first batch I saw, Panama Papers, that was 11.5 million leaked documents. Paradise Papers, 13.4 million documents. They're all around the same number. That's a lot to work through. And I'm sure with each of these releases, people are still working through them, collating the data, trying to connect the dots here, so to speak. But I've heard this talked about as this is the real one. This is the, maybe it's just marketing or hype or whatever. But from what you've seen, is there any reason to elevate this to a position above the others? Sir.
Not really. I think it's just more documentation, more proof of what's going on. Obviously, the quantity this time of the leak is bigger than before, but in a way, as some people have said, it doesn't reveal anything that we did not know before. We know that those things are going on. We just, it's difficult to get a complete assessment, obviously, because this is all secret. That's the whole point of putting things in tax havens and trust and offshore shell corporations. The whole idea is, so it's not seen. It's not supposed to be transparent. People don't know. And when it gets revealed, it gives us a better sense of what's out there. Now, the number of documents per se doesn't reveal anything. I mean, it just tells us, how many emails they managed to get, how many copies of contracts or other pieces of evidence in a way that shows who has been doing what to some extent. So it's just the quantity of documents. But what really matters ultimately is how big is this, right? Is it just marginal? Just a few rich people putting money away and trying to hide their assets and not pay taxes? Or is it a much larger phenomenon that involves ultimately trillions of dollars, that involves people who are ultimately making decisions about the world, right? Whether political or economic, and then saying, well, are they making the right kind of decisions, or are they making decisions that will end up benefiting themselves as opposed to, again, the average population or their country's interest? And that's really the main issue, because when you have, the average person in the U.S. or in Canada or anywhere else paying their taxes and, being law-abiding citizens, and then they see that the rich and powerful are able to hide their assets and not pay all the taxes that they should pay, then it takes away the trust that people have in those leaders. And then they wonder, well, why should I pay my taxes? Why should I listen to what these people are doing? Why should I be a law-abiding citizen when the rich people are not, right? Or they're corrupt, or they avoid paying taxes. So ultimately the big issue is one of trust, and trust is the basis of our society. It's the basis of our economy. If we don't trust each other, it becomes difficult to do business with each other, and that's what those papers reveal, is the extent of this is going on, and the fact that in a way the rich and powerful have means that the average person doesn't have. And again, it creates even more inequality in our society. And I think that's what those papers are telling us, and why, in a way, they're so scandalous, because we're like, how is it possible? And also, it raises another question. Like, where do they get the money? Sometimes when you have politicians who have hundreds of millions of dollars, I mean, in some cases, it's because they had businesses before going into politics, but often no. So then it makes you wonder also, where did that money come from?
Basically, their political connections giving them economic benefits and opportunities that most people don't have access to. I mean, and let's be clear, this is not somebody making $35,000 a year putting money into a trust in order to hide. This is the disgustingly wealthy doing this. How much money, just on estimate, how much money are they expecting, or do they believe is part of this offshore tax system? I guess that's the first question. But also, how are they able to pull this off? I mean, some of these things I would imagine are against the law, be it the tax havens or the trust, or are they? I mean, so I guess that goes into two forms. How much money is there estimated to be in these offshore systems, and how are they able to pull the scam off?
Right. Well, I mean, there are various estimates, as you can imagine. They range quite wide, since it's difficult to determine something that people don't want you to know exists, right? So we have estimates run in the trillions of dollars in terms of assets that would be, in offshore accounts and shell corporations and these kinds of things. And so you can imagine also what that means in terms of lost tax revenues for governments, right? So these are sums that people should be paying taxes on in terms of their income, and they're not. So and that runs in also the hundreds of billions of dollars, which could then be put to better use, either to give money to the poor or to maintain infrastructure or build new bridges or roads or put in healthcare, those kinds of things. So that's the sort of estimates around these things. Now, in terms of how can they do so? Well, it's some of it is legal, some of it is illegal. I mean, a lot of countries don't prevent you from taking your money out of the country and putting it in a shell corporation. It's perfectly legal. Then the question is, do you try to hide that you have those assets and the income that those assets generate, so that you don't end up paying taxes? So basically, you're hiding income. You're saying, no, I don't have that income. So you basically lie and tell the tax authorities that it's not there, and then it's very difficult for the IRS in the U.S. and other places to go and find those income. Like, they have to be tipped. In a way, this is what the leaks can allow, because all of a sudden the IRS can say, oh, now we have information. Okay, let's now inquire about this person or that person. Oh, we just found out that you have $400 million stashed in corporate shell account corporations in the Caymans or the British Virgin Islands or places like that.
Guernsey, wherever, Jersey, these
or
different,
South Dakota
or Delaware.
Right.
States, it's not laundering. It's like you're saying, tax shelters, finding tax shelters. It's legal, illegal. But I'm curious, these are major releases, and they've become a phenomenon, an internet phenomenon in their own way. Anytime this gets released, it's like a new kind of thing. But yet they keep coming. This is the third of them. They've all come within just a handful of years here. I'm curious, how much have they actually done? There have been 3 of them. The first one was released in 2017. That's less than 5 years ago. Only so much can get done, especially these are wealthy people they're dealing with who would have connections that would let them, extend the litigation process. In other words, how big of an impact have these had? How big of an impact do you think they will have going forward? Sir.
It's a very good question. Let's say that so far the impact has been limited. I mean, there's been a process to limit tax evasion and tax avoidance through the Organization for Economic Development Cooperation, the OECD, going on for now almost 20 years. I mean, it's had some elements in trying to create more transparency into the process as to who's doing what and having access. So if let's say, again, the IRS in the U.S. Suspects that someone is evading their taxes, they will, and they find out that they have a trust or some shell corporation in a tax haven, well, then they want to be able to contact that haven and say, hey, I need information on that person. And then, the expectation is that haven would cooperate, that those protocols are in place and all that, which wasn't the case before. Before it was like, well, no, we can't give you the information. We can't tell you who it is. We can't tell you the amounts, etc. Now there is more cooperation taking place, but it's much more about sharing information and trying to get more transparency into the system. But there's no regulation really about preventing those kinds of behaviors, right? Like the idea of, okay, should there be regulation that says, and I think there are some places that are looking at this, but not necessarily at the federal level. Sometimes it can even be at the municipal level, saying, no, if you're buying real estate, for instance, you're buying an apartment in New York or in Vancouver, and you're treating it as an investment, well, it cannot be a shell corporation, or it cannot be bought by a corporation. It has to be an individual. There has to be a person identified with that purchase, right? So those kinds of regulations to avoid, in a way, or make it much more difficult to hide the assets and not be able to know, okay, who is the rightful owner of that asset, of that house, of that chateau in France, right? So that those kinds of regulations that would prevent or make it much more difficult for hiding assets. But as long as those tax havens will exist, and they're not going away, because for a lot of these places, that's their second main source of income, right, beyond tourism. So they have no incentives to stop doing what they're doing, and therefore that you will always have people who will want to park their money there or hide their assets in those places through corporations. So then it's up to countries like the U.S. or Canada or the U.K. and other places to say, hey, those transactions are not legal in our country. You cannot have assets hidden in those shell corporations and things like that. Then do you start going after the accountants and the lawyers who allow these things to happen? So ultimately, there could be regulation that would make this much more difficult. But then again, then you have to keep track of all this. Then you need also more resources, administrative resources within governments to audit and verify and make sure that this is happening. And as far as I know, a lot of governments find that ultimately the amount that they're spending to recover these evaded taxes, the taxes that people should pay, often is actually not that much worth it. Like they're spending almost as much money in their own staff and lawyers and hiring people and tracking down those monies than they're collecting.
They're not even going to recoup the expense of what they're putting into it. And that could be as much on their own end, on their own incompetency, the running over of budgets looking into this stuff. But it's also a cat and mouse game, of course, where people who are trying to evade this kind of scrutiny would be willing to pay for it. And please, I just had a brief thing, not something we were planning on talking about, but it was something that interested me. You briefly mentioned a lot of these countries, it's like their number one, number two source of income. It's basically serving as a national tax shelter for wealthy people abroad. I'm curious, again, just something that personally interested to me. How exactly do they make that money? Is it like, do the fund managers skim off some and then they pay some of their taxes to the local government? Is that how that works? I'm just curious how they actually get that money, because I've dealt with this from other stories. This guy, Bill Browder, that we were talking about a while back, I've hit this a lot in that angle, but I'm curious, just generally, how do those countries make their money? What is in it for them? What are their incentives, basically?
Well, every time, let's say you register a corporation, right, in those havens, well, you pay an annual registration fee, right? So this is direct money into the coffers of that government just for setting up the corporation. And then there's an annual, corporate registration fee that you have to pay. So that's the first part. Is just, here we give you a corporation, which, under, let's say, Cayman Islands or the Bahamas or whatever it is. And then you give us, I don't know, $150 or $250 or $500 and or $1,000. I don't know what exactly, depends what the cost and the complexity. And that goes directly into the coffers. And if you have thousands and thousands of these things, which are just basically nameplates on a door, it's a pretty decent source of income for those countries, and it doesn't really cost that much. Then often you also have jobs that are associated with that, right? It does create jobs. You need administrative staff. You'll need lawyers in those places.
And the accountants, like you were talking about, who could themselves potentially be liable.
Yes, they're only liable if it can be proved that they participated in tax evasion. So again, that's the difficult part where, as you said, it's very much a cat and mouse game, where the tax authorities are going after, trying to identify this and who are responsible, and then it has to go through, criminal proceedings and all these things, and it can take years and years and lots of resources. And obviously, the rich people also have lots of resources, and they can use to try to move things around, make it more difficult, and appeal and all these things. And ultimately, that's kind of the problem where governments say, well, is it really worth it to spend all that time and money to recoup those sums, where sometimes, in fact, we spend more money than we actually get back ultimately. So then the question is, well, should we start at the beginning of the chain and say, no, those kinds of behaviors, hiding assets in corporations or shell corporations without knowing who the rightful owner is, is illegal. And if you do that, then immediately you're going to be fined, or where the transaction will not be allowed, or those kinds of things. And I think so. In a way, instead of playing the cat and mouse game, you need to set up sort of the barrier. Make sure the mouse can't get out from the beginning, and that means a lot of these transactions just cannot happen. But again, in some cases, they won't prevent people from hiding assets there. They will do it, and then they might say, okay, well, if the U.S. is blocking us, okay, we won't buy assets in the U.S.
Exactly.
If other countries are not doing it, we'll do it there, and then kind of things just move around. So ideally, the whole world should take part of this. But as we know, and that's part of the issue, is that a lot of the people doing this are also then often the people responsible for
making the laws,
decisions.
The politicians, the leaders, the elites, effectively. And that's why when you're talking about how expensive it is to recoup the money, that seems like a very plausible explanation. And it does make, and I'm not being denigratory there, but you can also hear maybe it's just that they're elites and they don't want to do it because they're benefiting from it. They don't want to actually shut this stuff down. They don't want to recoup the money. They don't want to set an example that they will then fall prey to a couple of years down the line with some other politician comes in and takes their offshore accounts down, that kind of thing. What's your take on that?
Well, one always has to look at the incentives, right? So yes, we talk the good talk, but and everyone's like, oh yes, of course, corruption is bad and tax evasion is bad and all that. But at the same time, a lot of these people say, hey, I work hard and I'm making money, so why can't I use this to improve my situation? And then why should I make it more difficult in the future for me to generate more wealth? And so, yeah, the incentives are not necessarily very well aligned. In some countries, it's even worse if there's a lot of corruption, if the government people are actually, taking assets from the states or being able to make kind of deals where they enrich themselves at the cost of the population. Well, then, they need to hide those things. They need to move those things out of the country so that, it won't be discovered, or if ever something happens, they can just flee the country and then they have their wealth in some tax haven somewhere.
Yeah.
Where they can just benefit, right? And then relax on a beach and live happily ever after. Then what's the incentive for those people to then want to change the system and participate in an internationally comprehensive regulatory approach to prevent those things from happening?
Well, I guess that leads to two questions. Do they pay taxes in the various locations? Meaning, I know that they're escaping or exuding eschewing paying taxes in their home country and everything else. But if someone is outside of the country, they come to South Dakota and basically put money into some kind of tax haven, or for that matter, put money into some kind of trust in South Dakota, does South Dakota as a government get tax money from that, whether that's Ireland or whether that's one of the other countries? And is the only way to really grapple with this is this kind of international regulatory body? Basically, the countries would have to come together, put their heads together in order to create some kind of, I guess, international law to prevent that type of hiding of the ball.
Well, there are talks about creating a sort of minimum tax rate, right? Something that is being negotiated right now. That's mostly for companies, though. But you could say it could also apply to individuals, especially if they're hiding or putting their assets, not necessarily hiding them, but putting their assets in trusts or tax shelters. That means that, it's easy. If you buy shares in a company, right, whether it's, Facebook or Walmart, and then you say, okay, well, I have a company in South Dakota or in, Vanuatu in the Pacific Islands, and that company holds those shares. Well, then when those companies pay dividends, then those dividends go to that corporation in those tax havens. Now, as long as the dividend stays there, the money stays there, then those places either have zero taxes or they have lower taxes, let's say, than in the U.S. So there would still be taxes paid to those places, but it would be a lot lower than you would pay in Canada or the United States, for instance. So that's part of the that's not necessarily tax evasion. It's like, well, the corporation is paying its taxes, it's declaring, so it's not, we're not lying or hiding it. But it just so happens that the legal owner of those shares or of those investments is a corporation in a country where the tax rate is 5% or 10% as opposed to maybe 25%. And that's part also of the problem is the fact that it's easy to just say, no, the shares are not owned by me, Patrick LeBlanc, living in Ottawa in Canada, but they're owned by a corporation in the Cayman Islands that, you can't tell who actually owns this, right? So then if the Canadian tax authorities come after me and say, hey, we know that you have shares in this, I'm like, well, no, I don't. Just try to prove it. Or I'll say, well, yes, I do, but, they're in a corporation, so I will only tax myself once I take the money out of the corporation. But as long as the money in that corporation, you can't tax me because I didn't touch it, right? So these are kind of ways where you can delay paying taxes, even if, and that's perfectly legal. So in a way, that also perhaps requires us to, should individuals be able to set up corporations, for instance, to hold investments, shares or others, when they're just, they technically should be held by the individuals themselves, as opposed to a bunch of corporations or trusts in between. So then it requires us to rethink also our national tax or even provincial in Canada or state tax systems in the U.S. to say, okay, do we allow this? Should only individuals, should they own shares or property directly and not being able to kind of leave those things in corporations where money can accumulate without paying taxes or by paying lower taxes?
But here's the thing there. You're talking about a complete restructuring of corporate law and business law in the States. And the largest powers at play here probably don't want that to happen because that would be a huge pain in the neck for them to go through with whatever that structuring looks like. I mean, as far as I can tell, you have these different types of corporations and different laws applying to, whether it's a holding company, whether it's a trust, different types of foundations. And these are all built, it seems to me, to handle inevitable complexities. In what type of organization is it? What responsibilities does it have, et cetera, that kind of thing. Nonprofit versus for-profit being one of the simplest and most graspable types of complexities that we allow and permit. But when you add those complexities in, you also let rich people who have lawyers who can navigate this Byzantine system use the obscurity that comes from that complexity to get what they want. And it seems to me they have this system locked in place. They know how to understand it. They know how to navigate it. They're probably not going to want to change it. Are they, Mr. LeBlanc?
Unlikely. And I mean, just to give you a very simple example, which is not about, evading taxes or anything like that. In Canada, a lot of professionals, and especially doctors, they're set up as corporations. And so they can, that's where their revenue goes, and then they can deduct the expenses related to their offices and things like that. And it also makes that they ultimately pay lower taxes than the average person who gets a salary. Now, the federal government here a few years ago tried to change that because it was considered kind of unequal and giving benefits to certain people who were still doing, kind of professionals earning money. And there was a huge uproar by those, in a way, small businesses, small professionals who said, hey, you're taking away our livelihoods. You're going to increase our taxes. Then the government backed down because it was the political pressure was just too strong. And that's the thing, right? As soon as you're taking money out of people's pockets, and in some cases, obviously, it's egregious, like the Pandora Papers, but a lot of these tax structures also benefit, let's say the upper middle class, which is quite numerous. And so would those changes affect these people too? And possibly. And then, as you said, you mentioned foundations. Well, foundations also do a lot of good work. So in terms of charity and all these things, not all of them, but many of them. How would that affect them? So you can imagine how politically it also becomes very sensitive. And then people, politicians say, okay, is that where we want to spend our political capital? Is it really worth it? And then ultimately they say, no, maybe it's better to put, our resources and energies into something else, whether, it's climate change or, the healthcare or something like that. And then it kind of stays, it doesn't really change, or it changes on the margin and slowly, which is why I think to go back to your question, is it really going to lead to a substantive or significant change? I doubt it.
No, especially when it comes to law. When it comes to the laws on the books, the systems in place that allow this stuff to continue, they will probably use this to hunt down specific people, I'm guessing, from what you were saying, who have been unearthed, whose, presence has sort of been inferred or directly pointed to. Their complicity has been figured out from this system, but it's not going to change the laws in the books that lets the whole thing keep rolling. It's Chinatown, Jack. They built it that way. One last brief question here. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, that's the outlet that published this stuff. You were talking about foundations and, a lot of the good work they do. International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, I've had people directing me to check out their supporters, includes some large foundations that people are suspicious of, including like Ford Foundation, a couple of other big ones. There's Open Society Foundations. That's George Soros' outlet. I know a lot of people are very squicked by that guy. People have different takes on these things. But you looking at this, looking at the ICIJ, looking at this release, I know you're not super deep into journalism. That's not your thing. How do you take this? Do you see bias in what they've chosen to disclose? Do you see bias in their work here? Sure.
I cannot. It's difficult. Then we would have to know exactly what they have. So one certainly cannot say there is bias or not. I think the fact that the Ford Foundation and the Open Society are funding this, I don't necessarily see that as a problem. I mean, a lot of these foundations do great work and support, a lot of, democracy and transparency in the world and those kinds of things. And I think that it just goes a long way. And I think we have to recognize that a lot of the newspapers outlets that are part of that consortium are very well respected. The journalists who are there are well respected. So in a way, I think we have to trust that they are doing their work at harm's length based on the information that they possess. Obviously, it's a huge undertaking, which is why all these journalists and news outlets have to cooperate with each other to share information, to analyze this. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't think that there is bias in terms of what is being reported.
That makes sense. I wanted to check with you. You would be the guy to know this kind of thing. You've looked into this stuff. This is your line of work as a professor, and clearly talking with you, you understand it. I'm just doing the general check on that, Jamarl.
I'm curious. What do you expect to take place from this? I mean, do you expect to be a political fallout, a legal fallout, going forward? I mean, especially with some of the names. I mean, Zelensky from the Ukraine, Tony Blair. I think it was the King of Jordan. I mean, you've had a lot of these guys who were political leaders in their country basically outed from this. What do you think is going to take place within the next few months over it?
Look, I think, as you said, in some cases, obviously, the tax authorities will say, "Hey, we didn't know about this." In some cases, they probably know. So it may not be news, but what they didn't know, it might prompt them, especially if they think that it's actually worth it financially to go after some of these people in terms of tax evasion. So there might be some tax bills coming up for some individuals. Doesn't mean that they're going to go to jail necessarily, but they might get significant tax bills associated with that. In other cases, there might be political fallout. I mean, there's an election in the Czech Republic, and one of the contenders, former Prime Minister Babiš, this information has come out. We'll see how it affects them. In other cases, if we're talking about leaders of countries, well, that's not going to change much, right? If they're in power, they're not going to launch. They'll probably not have their own tax authorities go after them, and they'll just say, no, everything, is above board. Yes, we declared this. It's all legal, so we don't have any taxes to pay. I think the fallout will probably be limited. In many cases, yes, it will just, let's say, tarnish the reputation of some of these people. But in some cases, it's not a surprise. A lot of the names that are there are not necessarily so surprising.
Makes sense. To me, it's not surprising either. Patrick LeBlanc, thank you for joining us this morning. It was great speaking with you.
It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure having you on. Professor of Economics and Finance at the University of Ottawa, also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI. That's Patrick LeBlanc. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Getting into it on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Hi, I'm political analyst Garland Nixon.
And I'm political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist Dr. Wilmer Leon.
We're the co-hosts for The Critical Hour, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C.
We close out your day with a thorough and hard-hitting analysis of the day's top stories, where we bring in brilliant scholars, authors, and investigative journalists from around the world.
And on Fridays, it's panel time, when we do a roundup of the week's most important issues.
Join us to keep up with the world's top stories.
Enjoy an in-depth analysis.
And have a little fun along the way. Listen to our show,
The Critical Hour, Monday through Fridays on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Lines are open. Again, 202-521-1320. I hope everybody's having a great morning this morning. It was a good show, fun show. It was great talking with Patrick. First time he's been on. He was a first-time guest, and he did a fantastic job. I was saying to you and to Austin, too, he reminded me of like Dr. McCall Kogan. The doctor will often have on to talk about COVID.
Easy, down to earth.
They both have a slight accent, which maybe also contributes to the mental impression, but they're very easy to talk to. They're very down to earth. You hit them with questions, and their response isn't like a categorical stumbling over it or something like this. They're like, I don't know. And they kind of talk about what, their take on it. And it feels very accessible and honest, which I like.
Yeah, the accessibility makes it that much easier to talk to him about. And look, it's a fascinating story. I mean, it's somewhat maddening on some level, or aggravating. Maybe that's the word for it, because it's like, we've had the Panama Papers, we've had those all of these P-name papers, and you would think at a certain point when it's like there are trillions of dollars that are basically held offshore in this kind of offshore tax haven system, but nothing is really being done about it. It's like we're just aware of it, and we can see it. We get evidence for it, that much more evidence for it. We even get proof positive of who's involved, but again, we meander along without there really being consequences. And, we've been having this kind of fight in the United States over, a $3.5 trillion bill for 10 years. So basically $320 or $350 billion a year. Well, the amount of money that's basically held off seas, that is basically hidden and locked away, easily pays for a lot of the stuff that people are complaining about and fighting about. But nothing is done per se. And I think you hit upon it, that many of the people who would have to do something about it, either pass the laws or either make adjustments to law, tax policy, are people who are basically benefiting from them being exactly the way it is.
That's the freaking elephant in the room.
Yeah.
That it's a shame it took us like 15 minutes to get into it. We were trying to set up the facts, we're trying to set up the basics or whatever, but you got to hit that, which is, wait, so all these systems are in place. Literally, the story we're talking about is, look at all these wealthy politicians all around the world, and celebrities, but let's focus on the politicians. All these wealthy politicians screwing over their population. They're taking money they've earned, and instead of paying taxes on it, which would go into the government they're running, they'd go into their government, they're putting it overseas. That seems pretty shady. Well, if that's the baseline of the conversation we're having, you should you should ask yourself, who watches The Watchmen?
Right.
Where's this coming from?
Yeah.
Why are they not solving this? Well, maybe because they're benefiting from it.
They're profiting from it, yeah. I mean, in real terms. I mean, there were several political leaders. I mean, Zelensky in the Ukraine, we're going to have somebody on to talk about that one tomorrow, but he apparently had some of the most corrupt aspects of this. And what's wild about it, he came in office on this corruption, anti-corruption platform of sorts. And all of a sudden you have this. I guess the catch becomes, are there political consequences, if not legal consequences? And from a political space, you would imagine various leaders or people who are in opposition using it as ammo to go after the people. But that's a far cry from legal changes to laws to make that work and change. One thing he did say, oh, good, we have a caller. But one thing, just to get to him, before I get to it, one thing he did say that was actually quite good was this notion that, well, it seems like it takes too much money to go after it after the fact. You almost have to get it in the beginning before any of that money gets distributed in the first place. So that is a good thing. All right, so we have a caller.
We've got Chuck calling in from Rockville. Chuck, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hi, I'm so giddy that you are actually covering this topic. I've been hounding on it for at least maybe 10 years or more. That it has far more implications than just political and economic. It is related to practically every national security issue that we're looking at, whether it's pandemics, whether it's terrorism, whether it's you go on down the line. And the bottom line is this is money, illicit money, that should have been going to prevent many of the problems we see today, the worst aspects of hunger and poverty around the world. And there's an article in the Washington Post in January of 2017 where they documented at least $32 trillion locked in offshore accounts. And that money could have been going to the development funds. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but it's the United Nations comprehensive approach to address the root causes of most of the threats we see today. And it's just off the chart important in terms of the connection between corruption, the rigged system, the rigged economics, political system that we have, and the degree to which we, the people, have not been paying attention to what our policymakers and have been doing. It goes as deep into the real estate industry in that there was another article in the Washington Post maybe 2 years ago documenting that at least half of the properties in the United States and large areas that are over $5 million in value, we don't know who owns them. Oh. This is part of the money laundering scheme that these offshore accounts tap into to increase their financial wealth. And the links are so pervasive to everything we do, everything we know about, that it's shocking that it's taken this long for it to come out. And the root issue has been privacy. The whole issue of privacy and anonymity that people are given, whether those people are drug dealers, whether they're terrorists, whether they're rich capitalists, oligarchs, kleptocrats. The list goes on to popular. Anyway. It's just I'm just so excited that it's finally being covered, and
I hope we do something with it.
That's the catch. Yeah, right.
We do
That's
something
the
with
catch,
it.
Chuck. It's like it's one thing to cover it; it's another thing for anything to actually happen to substantially change it.
We talked to him, and the first of these releases was in 2017. Now, granted, that's not too long ago, but we've seen 30+ million. I think you call it 35 million documents, pages, or whatever, released through these things. That's a big number. Not nearly as big as the $32 trillion you were talking about being actually, represented cumulatively in all of these different accounts. That's a lot more money. It's a much larger number, but all of it starts to pale. And people, this is going to be a weird connection, and I admit I'm being a bit subjective here, but tie this to the Snowden releases for a second. Those hit people a lot more close to home because it's wait, you mean my government could be watching me through my phone, on my computer, camera, webcam, whatever? Here's how I'm going to connect them. The general disillusionment and depression and detachedness of the world public, not just the American public, but yeah, it's true for sure, for force here. But the world public, from what their leaders are doing, what are we supposed to do with it? If they don't, they have multiple releases, massive releases, each of which should be ground shaking. What are they going to do with it?
We do need a global enforcement capacity. And, there's such resistance to empowering the United Nations or any other institution to work globally on issues. And that's why these forces of globalization, whether it's climate change or the pandemic, is so hard to deal with. But here's the one thing we can do. If we, the people, came together, at least in the democratic countries, and insisted that our governments first freeze and then start to seize some of this $32 trillion, and it's probably up more than that now, but to seize this money and direct it to the prevention, the fundamental issues that are driving.
I like it, but Chuck, here's the thing, man. Last summer, we were riddled with protests and riots or whatever, back and forth over a specific marginal issue that people would have hoped would have been used to bring up wider class issues, yet nothing seems to have been done with that. It just got stuck there. I don't know. Chuck, thank you for the call. First time caller, I do believe. Really appreciate it. We're going to close today's show out. We'll be back tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Eastern, folks. Fault Lines signing off. See you on the other side.